Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is let's start this from the beginning in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 61, Kabasawa Mines 7. Let's start this from the beginning. Kabasawa Mines 7. Shino knew that getting riled up about Guzan insulting his clan wasn't the smart thing to do, but in his defense, it wasn't as if he had actually lost all reasoning because of one single comment. No, his self-control was better than that. That being said, they had no other choice but to fight him regardless of whether they truly wanted to or not. Leaving the people they were supposed to protect on their own simply wasn't an option. Thus, he might just as well allow himself to get angry. As long as he managed to regain enough control over himself to not fall into a mindless rage, the rush of anger would actually be useful in drowning out the clump of hesitation and insecurity that had been sitting in the pit of his stomach ever since Guzan tanked his, Kibas, and Akamaru's combined attacks without as much as a scratch. That turned out to be a good decision, too, as it was only because of the rush of adrenaline that came with the anger that he could dodge their opponent's attack. While Shino jumped to the left, Kiba and Akamaru jumped to the right, all three of them managing to avoid being impaled by the pale purple crystals that burst from beneath their feet. Guzan was upon him as soon as he touched the ground again, probably judging him the lesser threat in close combat. But while that might be the case, Shino intended to show him how wrong he was in thinking he was easy prey. Guzan's fist flew straight for Shino's face, but instead of trying to dodge or even block, he swung his staff to redirect it to the side with just enough strength to make it miss his head. Then, changing his grip on the still extended staff, he jabbed his weapon forward, aiming for Guzan's face in turn, only to suddenly be forced to change his posture once more to bring his staff between himself and the kick that surely would have broken at least some ribs. While he managed to avoid that, the force behind it still threw him backwards. Shoton, Yari. Crystal Release, Crystal Lance. Guzan jumped after him, a 4-feet-long crystal lance forming around his right arm. Shino raised his staff to redirect the attack once more, but before he had even the chance to do so, he caught sight of a blur from the corner of his eyes. Guzan apparently saw it as well, raising his left arm to defend himself, and a second later, Kiba slammed into it with a screamed Tsuga on his lips. The resulting shockwave was enough to blow Shino's sunglasses from his face, but he barely even noticed. Instead, he focused on the confrontation in front of him where Guzan held his ground against Kiba's attack, not allowing himself to be pushed back even one bit. From the way the sunlight sparkled around his hand, it was obvious that he had used his crystal armor technique just in time. Ultimately, the showdown lasted for barely more than 3 seconds, and Shino didn't get the chance to intervene before a second blur appeared over Guzan and slammed into him, breaking his contest with Kiba and smashing him into the ground. Good job, Akamaru. Kiba yelled as he landed next to Shino, hands raised to initiate their plan for real. Now get dash. His voice was cut off when Shino slammed into him to push him out of the way from a dozen or so crystal spikes the size of his forearm that suddenly flew towards them from out of the dirt cloud. The two of them were back on their feet within moments, prepared for any potential follow-up attack, while Akamaru jumped away to hide somewhere else from where he could wait for another chance to attack. Well, that was a failure. Shino kept his glare focused on the slowly emerging form of Guzan. No matter. We simply try again. Plan Red didn't involve some kind of complicated series of attacks. Instead, it was a general approach that aimed to get their opponent into a specific position. How they got them there didn't matter, allowing them much more freedom in how they could act than if each of their moves depended on the success of a prior attack. It also meant they could try the plan again and again without giving anything away. Kiba scoffed. Let's hope the next attempt goes better than this one, then. One of Ataka-sensei's first lessons had been to always find their enemies' strengths and weaknesses before they did. To find clips in their armor to exploit and to fake such things themselves in order to throw them off their tracks. As of right now, Shino had yet to find a weakness in their opponent. In terms of strengths, on the other hand, well. Guzan clearly had an edge on both him and Kiba in terms of physical prowess. There was no doubt that he was stronger and, while not to the point where he could simply blitz them, faster than them. He had more experience, too, and surely his arsenal of techniques and chakra reserves were greater as well. However, his greatest advantage was obviously this armor technique. Shino's eyes widened in realization. He doesn't need to use hand seals to use his armor. Shino would have seen if he had waved hand seals before raising his hand to block Kiba's attack, but he didn't. In that case, actually hitting him will be pretty damn hard. Judging from his grimace, Kiba understood exactly how troublesome that was. Unless we manage to catch him by surprise, he will simply block whatever we throw at him. He was right, but Shino couldn't say that out loud. Actually saying it would, in his mind, be the same as admitting defeat, and he couldn't do that. We continue with Plan Red. Kiba's head jerked around. What? It's the best approach, he said, the calm he tried to portray to the outside belied only by the way the grip on his staff tightened. It's still the approach that leaves us with the most freedom. That doesn't mean a lot if we can't catch him by surprise. We dash. Don't tell me you're scared. That made Kiba's mouth shut with a snap. It might be a cruel tactic, but right now, insulting Kiba's ego was the easiest way to make him cooperate. Shino was sure that his approach was the best thing they could do at the moment, but he needed his teammates' help to pull it off, so if this was what it took to get it, he would do it. Did you two finish your little discussion? Guzan walked out of the dust cloud none the worse aware, the only difference being that he looked really pissed now. If you realize just how hopeless your situation is, why not just lay down and die? I promise I will make your death quick if you do. Despite the situation, Shino almost had to crack a smile at that. Kiba, on the other hand, had much less restraint and outright snorted. Really? Do you think you're the villain from some kind of children's book or something? Like, seriously, what's with that cheesy line? Judging from the pulsing vein on Guzan's forehead, that was apparently the wrong thing to say, though. Shoton, Gosen Kyuji. Crystal release, crystal spikes. Once again, they were forced to dodge pale purple crystal projectiles. This time, however, Shino didn't wait for Guzan to attack him. Instead, he rushed towards him first. Twisting out of the way from incoming crystals, Shino either avoided the attacks outright or, when that wasn't possible, smashed them aside with his staff before they could hit him. Then, as soon as he was within range, he swung his weapon in a wide arc towards Guzan's head. The man didn't bother trying to dodge or block, but Shino hadn't expected him to. With such a predictable blow, surely he would simply use his armor technique again to overwhelm him. He was proven right a moment later when his staff repelled against his head. Instead of letting that demotivate him, Shino whirled around his own axis, distinctively aware of the fist that barely missed him as he did so. A moment later, the tip of his staff slammed into Guzan's stomach. Although his body writhed on impact, he showed no reaction to indicate he had been hurt. That didn't matter much to Shino, though. Guzan made to grab the staff, probably expecting a follow-up attack, but instead, Shino took a step back, barely avoiding Guzan's hands. Then, he raised his staff to point directly at his opponent's head. A moment later, insects swarmed out of a nearly imperceptible hole at the tip and blasted right into Guzan's face. Now, he might be able to blast his insects away when they surrounded his body, but would he be able to do it if they were inside of him? Just as he had expected, Guzan blasted the insects that hadn't managed to get into his mouth away by creating an expanding sphere of crystals that quickly blew everything in the area around him into bits. Of course, Shino was long since gone by then. You damn dash. Guzan didn't have time to utter his no doubt very creative insult before a gray blur smashed into his side. This time, however, there were two important differences from the previous times this happened. First, the blur was almost twice as large as the ones before, and second, its color was in a much darker shade. So Kiba and Akamaru are working together this time, Shino thought, feeling hesitantly optimistic. And they're using the skin hardening technique Sensei taught them, too. They hadn't mastered it yet, meaning they could neither keep it up for as long as they would have liked to nor use it to strengthen themselves as much as theoretically possible, but even just using it to the level they were capable of already increased their attack power immensely. Shino had seen them tore through rock as if it was paper when they combined it with their Gachuga as they were doing now, so even if Guzan's crystals were stronger than rock, it would surely do something. Shino tried not to indulge too much in the satisfaction he felt at the booming explosion when Guzan was crushed to the ground. Kiba wasn't done with just that, though. He didn't even wait until the emerging dust cloud had dispersed before falling into a crouch, weaving hand seals, and slamming his hands on the ground. Doton, Doryu Taiga. Earth Release, Earth Flow River. Shino couldn't see it, but the surprised exclamation that could be heard from within the cloud meant that the technique was a success, trapping their opponent in place as the ground beneath him transformed into a mud river. Now it's my turn. Katon, Gokakyu no Jutsu. Fire Release, Great Fireball Technique. His fireball might still be a far cry from his sensei's, but it was more than enough to burn any enemy it hit to a crisp. It had been quite the surprise to find that he had a fire affinity. Such a thing was ridiculously rare in his clan, where most had either earth or water affinities. In fact, Shino's research showed that there were currently only 3 other Aberame alive who had one, and the clan records showed that there had been no more than 5 alive at the same time at any point in recorded history. Kiba had found this quite amusing, he remembered, saying something about it representing the passion he supposedly tried to behind a calm mask or some such nonsense. Unfortunately, it seemed that every Aberame, past and present, who had been unlucky enough to be born with a fire affinity hadn't even bothered with trying to come up with a way to combine it with their clan's techniques, deciding that its inherent danger for insects of any kind made it unsuitable for such. They usually didn't even bother with learning a lot of regular fire ninjutsu either. Instead, they ignored their affinity and concentrated on learning other techniques they considered more useful. Shino disagreed. So far, he had only one vague idea of how he could potentially combine his element and his Kikaichu in battle, one which he had yet to either test or even just discuss with his father, but he wouldn't give up. He would find a way to combine these two things. He was limited to regular ninjutsu for now, but it seemed that was more than enough. Even Guzen couldn't protect his entire body from fire, especially not when he was stuck in mud. Although he did send his insects out to make sure he was dead. Letting his guard down at a critical moment like this would simply be foolish. Plan Red, aka catch an enemy in Kiba's swamp and then burn them to a crisp, was a complete success. It actually worked, huh? Shino nodded. He didn't consider us a threat. Had he taken us seriously, things would have been different. You say that, but your expression tells a different story. And what kind of expression am I supposedly making? A smug one, Kiba chuckled. A very smug one. Everything went exactly according to plan, kind of smug, to be precise. Shino turned his head to actually look at Kiba, ready to reply with something appropriately sarcastic, and it was only because of this that he witnessed what happened next. One moment Kiba still stood next to him, and the next, he was blown away by a white blur that was barely visible to Shino's eye. Then, before he could do as much as blink and even before the explosion of Kiba slamming through several trees could reach his ears, a hand roughly grabbed him by his throat and lifted him into the air. So you really tried to make me eat bugs, huh? I'm sure you felt pretty clever when you thought of that, didn't you? Even if Shino had wanted to, with how tight the grip on his throat was, he wouldn't have been able to reply. As it was, even just breathing was a chore. Little shit, I will make you dash. Guzen stopped mid-sentence while whirling around to send a kick towards an incoming blur. A moment later, Akamera let out a pained yelp as he was smacked to the side, bouncing over the ground twice before finally coming to a stop about 30 meters away from them. Obviously, as he was still in Guzen's grasp, Shino was whirled around as well, but while the pain that shot through his neck as a result was far from comfortable, it allowed him to mount an escape attempt. Using the momentum of Guzen's movement, he thrusted the staff he still held tightly grabbed towards his opponent's throat while simultaneously releasing his Kikaichu. As expected, his staff didn't connect with soft flesh but some hard surface that couldn't be anything but a layer of crystal. Furthermore, now that he was so close to Guzen, Shino recognized the shockwave of chakra that was emitted from his opponent as soon as Shino's insects left his body. Although his Kikaichu were able to eat chakra, there was a limit to how much they could process at a time. Guzen apparently defended himself by emitting more chakra than they could handle to push them away. A wasteful strategy to be sure, but an effective one. That didn't matter, though. As he attacked with his staff and his insects, Shino also threw a kick towards the axle of the arm that held him up, using the distraction of his other attacks in the hope of surprising his opponent. Half a second later, his foot hit its target, and this time, he met no resistance. Guzan let him fall to the ground with a pained curse, and Shino didn't waste any time. Katon, Hijingaku no Jutsu. Fire release, hiding in ash and dust technique. The searing pain that surged through his throat as his chakra transformed into ash and dust almost made him reflexively cancel the technique. In fact, he didn't think he had ever felt so much pain in his entire life, and it took all he had to continue it. Using the distraction of the dust cloud, he jumped away, trying to get as far away as he could before Guzan found his bearings again. Shino didn't get far before he was grabbed by his shoulder and pulled away. In this instance, it was probably a good thing that his throat was in too much pain to allow him to make a sound, but that didn't stop him from lashing out with his staff. Another good thing was that Kiba had trained with him regularly enough by now to predict this reaction and stop the attack before it could either connect or make some kind of loud sound. "Relax," Kiba whispered harshly into his ear. "It's just me." Shino opened his mouth, but as soon as he tried to reply, his throat tightened, and the effort it took to stop the coughing fit that was threatening to overtake him and which would certainly have betrayed their position was enough to make him tear up. "Shit, he got you real good, didn't he?" Shino couldn't see him, but the concern in Kiba's voice was impossible to miss. Then, once it was clear Shino had somewhat relaxed, Kiba continued, "All right, just stay silent and listen, yeah?" Shino nodded. "Not that I have much of a choice, now have I? I might have a way to get through that armor of his." His eyes widened fractionally. Sensing the unasked question, Kiba continued, "The one I trapped in my earth technique earlier was only a clone. A crystal clone. That's how he escaped your attack. He didn't even need to use his armor to defend himself." Then, a grin spread over his face. "However, my Anakamaru's attack actually cracked it. Not enough to break through completely or anything like that, but if we can add just a little bit more power, I think we should be able to do just that." That would explain why the insects he had sent out to check on Guzan after he thought he hit him with his fireball hadn't seen the attack coming. While they were still en route to where the remains of Guzan's clone were stuck in the mud, the real one came for them from another direction. Regardless, all this mattered little if Kiba didn't actually have a way to break through Guzan's armor. "Just keep him busy for a minute or so," Kiba said, evidently knowing exactly what he was thinking. "Akamaru is already preparing a small trap, but that will not keep him busy for long. I don't think I can finish him off even if I actually break through his armor, though." He hesitated for a moment, looking rather nervous before he managed to hide it behind a confident facade. "I won't be able to continue to fight after I used this technique, so it depends on you to give him the finishing blow afterwards, and to be completely honest, I can't say for sure I will even be able to land a hit without some kind of plan, so." Kiba looked almost physically in pain when he continued. "You're better at this than I am, so you'll have to come up with a plan on how best to go about it." In all honesty, they didn't have much of a choice other than betting everything they had on whatever technique Kiba was talking about. Judging from how their previous short but intense confrontation had gone, and considering what Shino knew about his and his teammates' arsenal and abilities, this fight wasn't one they could realistically win. As much as it irked him, the best thing they could do right now was to send a message back to the camp, hope they take it seriously and leave, and try to buy them as much time as they could in the meantime before retreating themselves. However, if Kiba really has some kind of ace up his sleeves, then it might be foolish, but Shino didn't want to give up. He didn't want to admit defeat. Even as his heart beat wildly in his chest and his hands trembled with a combination of anticipation and anxiety, he didn't want to lose this fight. He should prioritize the lives of the people they were supposed to protect. Hell, maybe he should even prioritize the lives of him and Kiba. After all, this wasn't part of the original mission they set out for. Was it truly the right decision to risk their lives for this? Regardless of whether it was right or not, ultimately, both he and Kiba had already decided to do this. Even as Shino hesitated, he knew in his heart that he had made the decision the very moment they had decided to confront Guzan. After what felt like hours but couldn't have been more than a second or two, he nodded, motioning for Kiba to explain what technique he had in mind so that he could plan accordingly. They had only this one shot, so he would have to do this right. Failure simply wasn't an option. A few minutes later, Shino observed Guzan as he once again began moving towards his original target. This time, however, he used the trees instead of running over the ground like before, having clearly learned his lesson in that respect. He obviously didn't want to be surprised again the way he had been earlier. Shino and Kiba had been rather fortunate that he had waited so long before moving out again while they strategized. They had tried to hurry, of course, but even just a few minutes of a head start would have been a serious problem. The fact that Shino currently couldn't speak and thus had to explain his plan through a combination of hand signs and words written on the ground didn't make their situation any easier. Anyway, as luck would have it, Guzan started to run pretty much exactly when they finished their discussion. Thus, here he was, observing their opponent from afar while waiting for the first trap Akamaru had set to spring shut so that he could start his own attack and give Kiba, who was currently hiding elsewhere, the opening he needed. Shino didn't have to wait long. Just when Guzan landed on another branch, an explosion went off, enveloping the branch and the missing nin on it both in a blaze of fire. That wasn't enough to take him down, of course. Only half a second after the explosion went off, Guzan jumped out of the resulting smoke cloud, his clothes, which consisted of little more than tattered pants at this point, barely singed and his skin still unscathed. But the most important detail was that his entire body was enraptured by a layer of pale purple crystal. I thought he could only protect certain areas, not his whole body at once. Shino cursed inwardly before shaking his head to stop himself from getting distracted. This didn't matter. Whether he could protect his whole body at once or only some parts of it was of little concern as long as Kiba could break through it. This didn't change a thing. Their plan was still valid. If Guzan thought the ambush would be over after only one explosion, he would be wrong. The moment the first bomb went off, a chain reaction was triggered, resulting in over 24 more explosions all around him. Most were too far away to actually harm him, but injuring him wasn't their purpose in the first place. Much rather, the explosion tags had been placed in all the trees in the area to make sure Guzan would jump into one of them regardless of in which direction he tried to escape. The only way he could have taken to avoid them was backwards, but while Shino had a contingency plan in case he took that path, Guzan had fortunately jumped forward, making this point moot. Instead of harming Guzan, the purpose of this second set of explosions was to force Guzan down from the trees and back to the ground, and they did this just fine, their shockwaves pushing him away before he could reach another branch. That was when Shino struck. First, he sent out half of his remaining Kikaicho to swarm Guzan while he was still in midair. He would have liked to use even more, but unfortunately, his other half was currently busy preparing something else. As expected, Guzan repelled his insects a few moments later with a bellowed curse. However, it proved something Shino had been suspecting, bringing a relieved smile to his face. So far, Guzan had always deactivated his armor as soon as he no longer needed it, making it likely that he literally couldn't keep it up for long periods. Whether that was because it consumed too much chakra or because he simply lacked the skill to do so, Shino didn't know, but knowing this wasn't necessary anyway. Furthermore, he always deactivated his armor when Shino's Kikaicho swarmed him. Now, one would think it would be preferable to keep the armor up when surrounded by chakra-eating insects, so the fact that he didn't do so must mean he couldn't repel them while using it. Consequently, this was the best moment to attack. No sooner had his insects dispersed, a kunao with an attached explosion tag went off right in front of Guzan. The stifled cry that rang out a moment later was music to Shino's ears. He didn't let that distract him, however, and jumped toward his opponent even before the smoke cloud had vanished. He reached Guzan just as his feet touched the ground. Guzan's eyes widened when he saw him, his expression a mix of not only anger and surprise but pain as well, but he managed to lean his head out of the way to avoid the staff that would otherwise have hit him in the face. Shino didn't let up there and immediately followed up with another strike that Guzan blocked with one forearm, and even though both his arms were covered in burrs, having evidently used them to ward off the worst of the previous blast, he didn't even flinch. "You little shit have no idea what you just brought upon yourself." Shino wouldn't have replied even if he could speak at the moment. Instead, he withdrew his staff before Guzan could grab it and delivered a kick to the right side of his knee. Unlike his opponent, he could not suppress a wince when his foot hit his hard crystal. He didn't let that stop him from slamming his staff into the ground and pushing himself away to avoid Guzan's punch, though. He also used the brief pause to send a mental signal via chakra pulse to command the Kikaicho who had survived the earlier chakra overload to attack Guzan once again. The man jumped right through the swarm, dispersing them the same way he had done several times already and deactivating his crystal armor in the process. Shino also noticed that his breathing seemed a bit more labored than just a moment earlier. He had not much time to think about that, however, as he was immediately forced to defend himself. Redirecting Guzan's first punch with his staff to go wide, he took a step back to keep enough distance between them so that he could continue to use his weapon. Then, he did the same thing a second time when he directed another punch, and then a third time when he blocked a kick whose strength was so great that he could feel the power of the impact travel through his arms and all the way up to his shoulders. Shoton, Yari. Crystal Release, Crystal Lance. Shino had barely enough time to send another signal to his Kikaicha before he had to lean backwards to dodge the attack, not trusting himself to either try and reflect or outright block it, and well aware that he wouldn't have been fast enough had he tried to dodge it the traditional way. The crystal lance passed over him by a hair, sparing him the fate of being impaled by it, but there was little he could do to avoid the blow when Guzan slammed his arm around which the lance had formed down, smashing Shino into the ground. Now, while this was definitively still a much better fate than being impaled, Shino could have done without having his breath knocked out of him. His only consolation was that the weapon itself broke into many little pieces as Guzan stopped the technique to disperse Shino's remaining Kikaichu again. He did so in less than a second, but this short amount of time was all it took for Shino to gather himself enough to roll out of the way as Guzan stomped on the ground where his head had been a moment earlier. Following that, Shino couldn't do more than hastily bring his staff between himself and his opponent before the follow-up kick threw him backwards. For one moment, he felt weightless as he flew through the air, but he was quickly brought back to the present as he bounced off the ground with a painful gasp, and when he managed to twist his body to land in a crouch a second later, it was more due to muscle memory than actual skill. It allowed him to defend himself when Guzan came after him again, though, so he wasn't complaining. Besides, I wanted to lure him in this direction anyway, so there's at least that. Using his smaller stature, he ducked beneath the first wide swing before simultaneously taking one more step backwards and jabbing his staff into Guzan's stomach. Surprisingly, he actually hit soft flesh this time, and this unexpected turn was enough to throw him off for a moment and give his opponent an opening. Guzan grimaced just a little bit but otherwise took the hit without much of a reaction, apparently using his bulky and muscular build to tank the attack this time instead of his crystal armor. Taking advantage of Shino's surprise, he then grabbed the staff with one hand before he could pull it back while also throwing a punch at him with the other. With no other choice, Shino let go of his weapon and dodged the attack by falling further back. He didn't expect Guzan to throw the staff after him, unfortunately. It struck him in the stomach with enough force to almost make him throw up, and while he couldn't be sure, Shino thought he could hear some of his bones break under the impact. The pain that came with it was enough to make his vision go black, and even as his sight returned a few moments later when he found himself lying on his back without even remembering how he had ended up there, everything was blurred and dotted with stars. He was only jerked back into the present when a foot pushed down onto his chest. "You're going to pay for this, you hear me, you little punk," Guzan said, and even though the shroud of his dazed mind, Shino noticed that he appeared much more exhausted than their short bout should justify. "That dog boy was a pest, but you are the worst piece of shit I have ever met. By the time I'm done with you, you will beg for the mercy of death." Shino paid little attention to the, frankly speaking, rather cliché threats of his opponent. Instead, he focused on the chakra pulses he could sense from beneath him. "Oh, right," he thought blearily. "I wanted to lure him here, didn't I? I don't know where your stupid friend is hiding, but if he's smart, he's already long gone, which means you will have to suffer for the two of you. If this is the location, I need to initiate the next phase. Forget this mission and that damn captain. I don't give a shit about any of that. It's not like he can do anything anyway. No, I will focus all my attention solely on you. In that case, there's only one thing I have to do." Shino sent out a single command to the Kikaichu in the earth below him. That was the other half of his colony he had sent away before confronting Guzan for the second time, and it was for this very moment that they had prepared. It was time to let the trap snap shut. For one moment after he sent out his command, the world seemed to stand still. Then, without any prior warning, the ground in about a 10-meter radius around him and Guzan began to cave in. Guzan let out a surprised grunt, and Shino used that short moment of distraction to make his move. With the ground beneath his back giving in, the pressure on his chest where Guzan's foot pressed down on him momentarily lessened, allowing him to push the limb away and free himself. Moreover, disregarding his protesting ribs, he pulled his legs to his chest before using Guzan's ones to catapult himself away, resulting not only in himself being hurled out of the affected area but also in Guzan's legs being swept away from under him and consequently preventing him from escaping himself. The ground where Guzan was currently sinking in had been purposefully prepared for this trap. First, Kiba had used a greatly underpowered version of his earth flow technique to soften the earth in the targeted area without actually turning it into mud so as not to give it away. Afterwards, Shino had sent out one half of his remaining colony to dig in and loosen the earth even more until it was just about ready to collapse. He hadn't been sure whether they would truly be able to do this without accidentally weakening the ground to the point where it would give in as soon as someone stepped onto it, but apparently, they were. At that point, it had only been a matter of him giving them the final command to make it collapse for good. However, while it might have caught Guzan by surprise, he would be able to free himself sooner rather than later, so Kiba had to hurry if Jinjuken Behenge, Sotaro. Human-beast combination transformation, double-headed wolf. Shino only had a little more than a second to stare at the huge, two-headed white wolf that came flying down before it changed color to a dark black, a telltale sign of the earth technique Kiba used to harden his skin, and started spinning, and although Kiba had told him about it, he still had to mentally convince himself that this was indeed his teammate and not just a hallucination of his still befuddled mind. Then, the creature slammed into Guzan, making the ground around them explode while the resulting shockwave was powerful enough to throw even Shino, who was almost 15 meters away until he was forcefully stopped by a tree, the impact almost making him almost faint on the spot as his ribs screamed in pain. However, he gritted his teeth and forced himself to stay awake as he watched the slowly dispersing dust cloud for any signs of either his teammates or their opponent. He had no idea how long it took, but then, finally, he caught sight of Kiba and Akamaru, lying approximately 10 meters away from the epicon tray of the impact. Both were unconscious, too, but a quick glance confirmed that neither had any noteworthy injuries and that both were breathing steadily. Kiba had said that he would be out of it after the attack, but Shino had still needed to make sure that it was really only the after effect of their own technique that had knocked them out rather than some desperate counter-attack from Guzan. Now that he had confirmed that, he could relax somewhat. And thinking of Guzan. Fucking unbelievable. The man looked much less imposing than he had earlier. His long white hair, which had previously reached halfway down his back, was mostly torn out and now barely reached his shoulders. His chest was bloodied and covered with deep gashes. His left arm hung limply at his side, and pieces of crystal, which must have been the remains of his armor technique, were slowly crumbling to the ground. His face hadn't been spared either, with blood running down his forehead and a grievous cut over his right eye marking the making of a new, second scar for him. Even so, however, he somehow still stood on his feet. "Oh, you will dash," a coughing fit interrupted him, but he managed to suppress it after just a few seconds. "You will pay for this." "Stay calm," Shino told himself as he slowly straightened up to sit with his back against the tree. "We expected this. Just follow the plan." Hidden in the sleeves of his jacket, he formed a single hand seal. Guzan took an unsteady step towards him. "Don't think you have won this," he said with a hoarse voice. "You may have hit me, but I can still move." He pulled a face that was probably supposed to be a fierce grin but actually looked more like a pained grimace than anything else. "You, on the other hand, can't." He wasn't wrong. Kiba and Akamaru were unconscious while Shino struggled to even just sit upright. Although Guzan looked terrible himself and would probably lose hands down to either of them if they were still rested, the fact alone that he could still move, albeit unsteadily, was more than enough to give him the edge. Fighting him simply wasn't possible. At least physically, that is. It was most likely this little detail that allowed Shino to stay calm. Calmer than he had been at any point during the entire fight, even. Although to be fair, the concussion he suspected he had could also play a part in that. He might think Kiba's technique has been our final attack, but in truth, this is. After all, you're supposed to keep your trump card hidden until the very end. As if on command, Guzan's eyes suddenly widened, and he let out a breathless gasp before he fell to his knees. What the dash? He couldn't even finish the sentence before he doubled over in pain, grasping his chest with his one good arm. My Kikaicha, consume chakra, he managed to croak, the desire to, frankly speaking, glowed overriding his instinctive urge to rest his throat. But they can also transfer it to others. I have a fire affinity. He couldn't have kept the smug grin from his face even if he wanted to. I assume you don't. The Aberame clan bred many different kinds of insects. Each individual colony was, of course, unique in some way, but they shared most characteristics with other colonies of the same species. For example, his Kikaicha were part of the common evolutionary lineage injected into each clan member shortly after birth, and although each individual colony gained individual traits depending on how their hosts used them, they generally all shared some basic properties. Most notably, the ability to consume and distribute chakra. There was another, rarer but still somewhat common breed that could rapidly grow in size if they consumed chakra, growing as tall as grizzly bears if they just fed enough, and that wasn't the end of it. There were many ways to direct one's colony in a certain direction to gain one of the many abilities his clan had recorded over the generations. However, most clan members would never use anything else than the breed they had been injected with upon birth, remaining for all their lives limited to what ultimately remained basic Kikaicha regardless of whatever quirks they might develop in the process of their evolution. Simply put, most were just not capable enough to handle the more advanced breeds. For example, other than Shino's father, there was currently only one other Aberame, Shino's cousin Torun, who was judged to be talented enough to use venomous insects. After all, there was a very real danger of keeping such lethal insects within one's body considering all it took to accidentally kill oneself was a random mutation in a single insect that resulted in a new poison against which the host wasn't immune. Shino was far from being skilled enough to be considered capable enough to breed such a species himself, but that didn't stop him from getting inspiration from them in his quest to find ways to combine his chakra affinity with his clan's techniques. And it was this quest that led him to the question of what would happen if he used his Kikaicha to not simply transfer his chakra like he would do to refill the reserves of a comrade but instead chakra to which he added his fire nature. After all, shouldn't it theoretically function similarly to poison? And how did the other person's own affinity play into this? Would this strategy only work against people with a wind affinity, which was weak against fire, or would it work just more effectively on those but still work to a lesser degree against anyone who didn't have a water affinity? Shino didn't have the opportunity to speak with his father about his theories, much less actually test it, so what better time to do so than the present, right? After getting hit by Kiba's attack, Guzan must have been in a lot of pain. So much pain, in fact, that the sensation of Shino's surviving Kikaicha latching onto his legs beneath his pants and on his back out of his sight didn't even register until it was already too late. By then, all the chakra he had fed to them in advance was already transferred into his system. Judging from the way he, who Shino was pretty sure had an earth affinity, reacted to it, it certainly did something. The other man raised his head to look at him from where he kneeled on the ground about 15 meters in front of him, his head and upper body turning redder by the second. You little shit. Shino blinked, the words sounding oddly distorted to his ears. Now that he thought about it, his vision was even more blurred than just a minute ago, too. Guzan was slowly getting to his feet again while using his one good arm to try, and fail, to swat away the insects on his body. You will pay for this. Shino could still make out that his mouth was moving, even if only just, but the words made no sense to him as his body began to feel heavier by the second. Even as Guzan began to slowly but surely move towards him again, all he could think about was how very tired he felt. I was right. This technique does work. And with that last fleeting thought, Shino finally followed his teammates and drifted into unconsciousness. Even with the fog of pain and exhaustion setting over his mind, Guzan still had the mental capacity to feel pure, unadulterated rage at the realization that it was two children with their pet dog and stupid bugs who were responsible for his current state. At the realization that he had almost lost to them. It was a disgrace. Shameful and embarrassing. If he still cared about what his family would think about him if they were still alive, he would probably have killed himself to avoid having to face them after this. However, regardless of how unreasonably close the result was, in the end, he had won. Nobody would have to know about the details of this fight, and he himself could simply forget about it. Never waste a single thought about this day ever again. He was on the verge of losing consciousness himself, but before that, he would kill these brats. It might be a much less creative death than he would have liked to grant them and less painful for them than they deserved, but this was still preferable to one of them waking up before him and killing him. As long as I would appreciate it if you could keep your hands off my students. Guzan froze, and it wasn't because of shock or fear. No, he literally couldn't move no matter how hard he tried. Is this Genjutsu? It was only then that he saw the figure that now stood protectively between him and the Abarame brat. His sight might be blurry from exhaustion, but he would have recognized these red eyes everywhere. You dash. A quick strike to his neck interrupted him before he could utter more than that single word. Guzan was unconscious even before his face hit the ground. Chapter 62, Kabasawa Mines 8. Let's start this from the beginning. Kabasawa Mines 8. Forcing all her doubts into the furthest corner of her mind until they were nothing more than a silent whisper in the back of her head that she could ignore, Hinata pushed herself off the ground with as much power as she could muster. Unfortunately, rather than being caught off guard, Yawaka merely grinned as she clasped her hands together in front of her before Hinata had crossed even half the distance between them. Genwakuteo. Blinding sun. A moment later, a radiant light flooded the area. The blinding light that radiated from Yawaku bothered Hinata in more ways than one. Just like any other person, she had no other choice but to instinctively close her eyes in face of the bright glow. What distinguished her from other people, however, was her Byakugan, and where they usually gave her an advantage, they now made the situation only worse. Her clan's dojutsu was sensitive to bright light in general to the point where the stimuli triggered by a flash bomb could be enough to force a Hyaga to deactivate their Kekii Genkai whether they wanted to or not if they didn't close their eyes quickly enough. Yawaku's technique was much more dangerous than a flash bomb, though, as it was ultimately still something powered by chakra. Very bright chakra at that, too. Due to the Byakugan's ability to see chakra, this meant that even if she were to close her eyes, Hinata couldn't escape the light as long as she kept her dojutsu activated. The only thing she could do was to deactivate them and keep her eyes shut. Unfortunately, no sooner had she done that than she was already being punished for it, the short moment where she was distracted by the burning sensation in her eyes and her sudden blindness being enough for Yawaku to close the remaining distance between them and throw Hinata back with a kick to her guts that was strong enough to almost make her throw up. Her body reacted on its own, righting itself while still in the air and ultimately allowing her to land on her feet instead of crashing to the ground even though her legs almost buckled beneath her from the impact. Regardless, it was thanks to this that Hinata was in a position to immediately jump away and dodge the projectiles that then harmlessly sank into the ground. Oh! Yawaku cooed, and although Hinata couldn't see it, she was sure the other kunoichi had plastered a belittling smirk on her face. Not bad, sweetheart. Not bad at all. But how long will you be able to dodge if you can't even see? She didn't give Hinata the time to reply before continuing her onslaught. With no other choice, Hinata began to run, not stopping for even a second so as to not make herself a target while simultaneously trying to keep her movements as unpredictable as possible. Nevertheless, she wasn't naive enough to truly believe that this would be enough. That she would be able to continue to dodge like this for long. The only reason it worked at the moment was that Yawaku wasn't taking this fight seriously. The moment the other woman grew bored and decided to end this, Hinata wouldn't stand a chance. She needed to do something. Fortunately, while most strategies the Hyaga clan had come up with to fight Ateo over the years were beyond her abilities, the most fundamental one upon which everything else was built wasn't. Dedicating every ounce of focus she could spare while continuing to dodge Yawaku's attacks, she cautiously reactivated her Byakugan. Now, it was hard to describe her clan's dojutsu to someone who didn't possess it. It was a bit like explaining what colors looked like to a person that had been born blind. Just like regular people could see things in the corner of their eye even when they were focusing on something right in front of them, a Hyaga was vaguely aware of everything that happened within the range of their vision even when they focused on something in particular. In that, they were similar. The important difference, however, was that Hyaga not only had a much greater range but could, for a lack of better words, zoom in and out on certain areas if they wanted to as well. Their control over what they saw was much better than that of a regular person. It followed that a Hyuga would be able to simply not look at a certain area when activating their Byakugan, and right now, Hinata did her very best to ignore the bright spot where Yawako stood, standing out like a sore thumb in the otherwise black and white world of her enhanced vision. It wasn't easy. As aforementioned, a Hyuga was always vaguely aware of everything that happened within the range of their Byakugan, so it was impossible to ignore the blinding light entirely. However, while it still stung, it didn't interfere with her ability to keep her dojutsu activated as long as she didn't focus on Yawako or the area directly surrounding her. Thus, she now could not only make out her opponent's approximate position but also the projectiles she was shooting at her. After all, while these chakra constructs were bright enough to sting when she focused on them, their glow wasn't as intense as whatever surrounded Yawako, meaning Hinata would have no problem deflecting them if she needed to. Regardless, for the moment, she simply continued dodging as she had been doing for about half a minute now. Itaka-sensei had taught her team to use their opponent's weaknesses, which in this case meant Yawako's tendency to underestimate her, against them as well as how to fight without their greatest strengths, which for Hinata was her sight. The latter focused on close combat, though, so until now, that training had been not all that helpful. Hinata intended to change that. If her opponent wanted to underestimate her, that was fine with her. She would use what she had been taught and make Yawako regret her carelessness. She could do this. From one moment to the next, Hinata changed direction, jumping straight towards Yawako and slashing through her attacks instead of dodging them. Then, not wanting to give her any time to react, she reached into the conveniently placed weapon pouch hidden under the servant's kimono she was wearing to pull out a smoke bomb which covered the area in a thick layer of smoke a moment later. After all, if her opponent took away her tension, it was only fair that she returned the favor, right? Hinata would be fighting blind once she broke into Yawako's defense, but as previously mentioned, she had been trained for that. She was far from a master in that field, of course, but from what Itaka-sensei had said, learning to fight blindly was a surprisingly uncommon practice, so the odds of Yawako, who came from a family that specialized in fighting by blinding others to gain an advantage, being able to do the same were slim. In such a confrontation, Hinata should have an advantage. The emphasis was on should. Knowing that she wouldn't be able to use the gentle fist to close her opponent's tenketsu when she couldn't even see her, Hinata raised her hands to form hand seals, intending to use another technique her sensei had taught her instead when she noticed an immense buildup of chakra right in front of her. Isen ni Idoru. 1,000 needles. It was only because she had noticed the buildup of chakra that Hinata could react in time. Hakusho Kaiten. 8 trigrams, palm rotation. Where her opponent had previously only shot about half a dozen projectiles at once, there were now more than she could possibly count. In fact, to Hinata, there were so many of them that it almost appeared as if it was a wall of light that was flying right towards her instead. It was fortunate that they were flying aimlessly in every direction rather than being focused all on her, at least. She wasn't sure she would have been able to block all of them if that were the case. It was a close call as it was. Hinata continued to rotate for longer than she could remember having ever done before, blocking the attack while simultaneously blasting the smoke cloud away she had created herself just a few moments earlier. 5 seconds quickly became 10, then 15, and ultimately a little bit more than 20 before the onslaught finally stopped. Hinata came to a halt, gasping for air and desperately trying to keep her balance as the world around her continued to spin. She had never used this technique for so long, and the amount of energy it had required to do so was nothing to scoff at. If she was forced to do this just 3 or 4 more times, she would be out of chakra in the blink of an eye. However, using a smoke bomb to blind me in return, Yawako said. How clever of you. But tell me, where's your pride as a Hyuga? You know, I thought with how proud your clan is of these ugly eyes of yours, something like using weapons or tools would be beneath your notice. I might be a Hyuga, but I'm still a kunoichi as well. Not using everything in my arsenal would be stupid. Even while she replied, Hinata focused on something else. Namely, the fact that Yawako, despite her best efforts to hide it, had been slightly out of breath when she spoke up. Apparently, that last technique of hers wasn't without cost either. The reason Yawako hadn't used it before was probably the amount of chakra necessary to use it, so this at least meant that she couldn't simply spam it to beat her that way. Hinata ignored the voice at the back of her head that reminded her that Yowaku, being a few years older than her, most likely had larger reserves than her and consequently could, in fact, beat her if she truly made this a battle of attrition. I wonder what your family would say about that. I like to think they would congratulate me for doing everything in my power to survive. Yowaku scoffed. Don't be ridiculous. They would probably scorn you for disgracing your clan and yourself or something silly like that. While her clan took great pride in their fighting style, they were smart enough to understand the value of other methods. Yes, as heiress, there was more pressure on her to focus primarily on the gentle fist, but not to the point where she should rather die than use something else. Her opponent's remark supported Hinata's suspicion about her upbringing, though. In all likelihood, she probably felt her family had stifled her growth by limiting her to their family's techniques, although it was a bit weird that she had yet to use anything else for the duration of their fight even though she had assumingly been a missing nin for a while and thus theoretically had more than enough time to study a variety of other techniques. Maybe her feelings for her family were more complicated than she would like to let on. Regardless, this gave Hinata an opportunity. If her opponent was so sensitive to that topic, it was something that could be used against her. I'm sorry, she said while trying to borrow some of the acting skills she had witnessed Itaka-sensei demonstrate in their first conversation with their client shortly after they had arrived at the mansion to sound sincerely apologetic. You didn't have it easy, did you? In all honesty, she felt like an idiot saying that. Would Yowaku really buy that? Apparently, and much to Hinata's surprise, she actually did. What? Yowaku's voice was unusually quiet. Why would you dash? Your family hasn't been nice to you, have they? Hinata continued, not allowing the other woman to finish. It's only natural that you weren't happy with them. You don't need to be embarrassed about it. It isn't your fault. I don't know what you're talking about, but dash. Oh, I know. Hinata exclaimed, channeling her inner Kiba to sound excited as if she just had a great idea. Why don't you come with me to Konoha? I'm sure Sandaime-sama would gladly grant you asylum if you tell him what terrible people your family are. Wouldn't that be great? For a few seconds, there was silence, and Hinata almost believed she had either misunderstood or miscalculated something when Yowaku finally replied. You know, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, I did feel a bit sorry about having to rip your eyes out of their sockets. It's always such a shame to ruin a pretty face. She paused. However, I changed my mind. I think I will actually enjoy doing it now. Before Hinata had the chance to even process that her plan to rile Yowaku up had somehow worked, the other woman pushed herself off the ground to rush at her. Sanbamu Yari. Sunbeam Spear. Hinata had wanted to make this a close combat fight, but that was before Yukawa used some kind of technique she didn't know. She unfortunately didn't get a choice on that matter, though, as her opponent closed the distance between them before Hinata had the chance to jump away, forcing her to adapt on the spot. Yowaku was still radiating bright light, meaning Hinata couldn't see her attacks coming, but she had trained for this. Trusting her ears, Hinata twisted around and crossed her arms in front of her just in time to block a kick, surprising herself when she could actually keep up with the strength behind it instead of being pushed back. If Yowaku didn't have the power to overwhelm her, then she might actually be able to. Hinata didn't get to finish that thought. She had just raised her left arm to block another attack she had noticed thanks to the sound of fluttering fabric from Yowaku's dress while simultaneously preparing to attack with her right one when a warm sensation on her left hand made her react on instinct. Instead of going through with her initial plan to block whatever attack was coming, she instead pulled back and jumped away. It probably saved her both her arm and her life because although she had managed to dodge the worst of it, Yukawa's attack still grazed her, cutting through the fabric of her kimono and leaving a small gash on her forearm. Had she not moved, she wouldn't have been so lucky. She made herself a weapon, she realized, her blood running cold. A weapon made from sunlight. She could probably destroy it if she managed to hit it just right like she had done with the projectiles earlier, but without being able to see it, it was much more likely that she would end up maiming herself. Which meant she couldn't go on the offensive. Hinata continued to dodge and defend herself as she backed further and further away. She listened to the flutter of clothes to predict Yukawa's attacks, paid attention to the sound of crunching earth beneath their feet to predict her position, and strained her senses to their absolute maximum in order to notice the heat that always heralded the approach of Yukawa's weapon. She slapped an incoming fist aside before taking a step back. She ducked beneath a kick by crouching low to the ground before trying to sweep her opponent's legs away beneath her, only to abandon that plan when she noticed an incoming strike of the weapon at the last possible second and fell further back instead. She blocked her arms to defend against another kick which she allowed to push her back to get some more distance between them. And during all that, she was collecting more cuts and gashes by the second. None of them was a serious injury yet, and none of them even impeded her, as the injuries she received during training were often more painful than this, but given enough time, they would still bring her down. It was only a question of when, not if. And yet, Hinata didn't feel panic. Quite the opposite, in fact. She still felt an ounce of fear at the realization that she was fighting a missing nin, and she was well aware of the danger she was in, but even with all that in mind, she didn't panic. It wasn't the same focus that had taken over her mind during her fight against Lee or even the Boars, but she still felt much more focused than even during her team's regular training sessions. The reason for that was that her current exchange with Yawaku proved that she wasn't as outclassed as she had initially feared. Yes, she was on the back foot, but even though she was fighting blind against her while Yawaku definitively fought to kill with all her might, Hinata held her own. She wasn't simply overwhelmed and killed off. Yawaku, for all that she was older and surely had more experience, wasn't all that much stronger than her. If Hinata was being honest, she might even be weaker than she weren't it for that one technique that made it impossible for her to use her Byakugan to its full potential. It was this realization that made her draw new courage. Hinata would later blame the impulsiveness of her next action on that. The next time Yawaku slashed at her with her weapon, Hinata didn't step back after avoiding being cut open by it and instead jumped right at her. That immediately resulted in a fist to her gut, but as that was clearly just a knee-jerk reaction rather than an intentional attack, it hurt but also lacked the power to stop her. Thus, Hinata could come close enough to aim a palm strike of her own. She still couldn't see her opponent, of course, so there was no way for her to close her tenketsu. She might be able to do some damage if she got a lucky hit and used enough chakra, but that wasn't its true purpose. She didn't even use chakra whatsoever in this attack. No, she simply wanted to get rid of her for a moment and create an opening. And to do that, she channeled her lightning nature into her palms. Her control wasn't good enough yet to use this method for a lethal attack without using a weapon as a medium, but judging by the pained cry as her palm connected with Yawaku's chest, it was more than enough for her purpose. Using the short distraction, she immediately began weaving the hand seals for the only ninjutsu aside from the academy ones she knew. Raiten, Amigamo. Lightning release, spider web. Hinata slammed her hands on the ground and released a surge of electricity that then poured in every direction to form a web around her, electrocuting Yukawa who had been caught in it. The attack wasn't particularly powerful, but it didn't need to be. Its purpose was to stun an opponent to allow the follow-up attack to hit, and for that, it was just strong enough. Or at least, it should be. Unfortunately, rather than stunning Yawaku, it resulted in her body falling apart in a pile of rocks. A clone, Hinata thought numbly. That wasn't what her mind focused on, though. The true problem was the figure of the real Yawaku that had now been revealed. She has been hiding at the edge of the light emitted by her clone's technique, she realized. But since when? Hinata wanted to immediately continue with her offensive, taking advantage of the opportunity now that she could actually see her opponent, but the surprise of the sudden turn of events was enough to make her freeze for just half a second, giving Yawaku enough time to take the initiative. Isen ni Idoru. 1000 needles. There was only one thing Hinata could do in response. Hakusho Kaiten. 8 trigrams, palm rotation. Just like the last time, the attack continued for longer than Hinata was comfortable with, and although it lasted for only 15 rather than 20 seconds this time, her own diminished reserves meant that it felt just as, if not even more exhausting than the last time to keep her own technique up for that long. However, if there was one good thing about this situation, it was the time it gave her to plan. Thus, the very moment the onslaught stopped, she made her move. Hakusho. 8 trigrams vacuum palm. Yawaku had just been in the process of raising her own hands, probably intending to use the same technique her clone had used to radiate blinding light, but she was forced to abandon that idea in favor of trying to dodge. She actually managed to avoid the brunt of it, the wave of chakra only hitting her shoulder instead of smashing straight into her chest, but that was still enough to throw her backwards for several meters before her back hit the ground. Hinata didn't hesitate and began rushing towards her at once. "Don't get arrogant, you stupid brat!" Yawaku yelled, the panic both in her voice and on her face making up for quite a contrast to her earlier attitude. "One lucky hit means nothing." She then raised her hand to shoot some more projectiles made from sunlight at her. That was of no concern for Hinata, though. Compared to her earlier attacks, these half a dozen projectiles were nothing. She could easily defend herself against them. Not even bothering to dodge lest she slowed down and gave Yawaku even one more time to prepare herself, Hinata lashed out with her left hand to destroy them. The moment she made contact with it, however, pain shot through her hand and up her arm all the way to her shoulder when she found herself with the senbon stuck in her palm. The only reason her face and upper body weren't hit by the remaining 5 projectiles as well was that she got lucky, as her flinch at the sudden pain resulted in her left arm getting in the way and getting hit instead, and while that hurt, she was still aware enough to understand that this was preferable to the alternative. She has wrapped the senbons with her technique to hide them, Hinata thought. Because the light is so bright, I could impossibly see them. She knew I wouldn't bother with dodging and used that against me. And the worst of all? This attack had stopped Hinata's offensive, giving Yukawa more than enough time to collect herself. Genwaku Teo. Blinding Sun. Once again, radiant light erupted from the other woman's body, and once again, Hinata's Byakugan was rendered more or less useless. And just like that, we are back at the very beginning. "I can't believe you caused me this much trouble," Yawaku muttered while trying to catch her breath, a far cry from the playful and condescending facade she had put up earlier. "Damn it, just you wait. Not even Kumo will want you when I'm done with you." Hinata barely listened as she crouched with one knee on the ground about 20 meters in front of her, her own breathing as labored as Yawaku's while she absently-minded began to remove the senbons stuck in her left hand and arm with only the slightest of winces at every pull. Had she gotten too overconfident? She thought she stood a chance when she realized her opponent wasn't all that strong at all. But what if it was just because of that realization that she had rushed into her own defeat? Hadn't one of Ataka-sensei's first lessons been to correctly assess their opponent's strengths and weaknesses and then act accordingly? To judge whether it was better to stay and fight or turn around and flee. While it wasn't as if she hadn't done that at all, she had certainly not paid as much attention as she should have. Hinata hadn't been in a position to flee, so staying to fight while waiting for reinforcement, and on that note, shouldn't some have arrived by now? Had been her only option. Yawaku's strengths were clear as well. She had a slight physical edge due to her age, possessed intimate knowledge about Hinata's fighting style, and also practiced a style of her own that was basically tailor-made to beat Hyuga. Her weaknesses, while not quite as clear, hadn't been too hard to figure out and exploit either. She underestimated Hinata and had a weak spot for the topic of her family. However, couldn't she have done better? She might have riled Yawaku up by speaking ill of her family, but after that, did she have any sort of plan? Did she have anything else in mind to really exploit that weakness? The answer was no, she hadn't. And before that? Sure, she did try to use her smoke bomb to hinder Yawaku's sight as well, to use her sensei's teachings about fighting without access to all of one's senses to her advantage, but that approach had been thwarted quickly enough. By itself, the idea of taking her sight as well might have been a good one, but it was of little use if Yawaku could simply use that technique where she shot projectiles in every direction to defend herself. If she did that, Hinata had no other choice but to use her palm rotation, effectively dispersing all the smoke in the area and consequently rendering the plan to hinder Yawaku's sight useless. It would be an entirely different matter if there was another way to blind her, but unfortunately. Wait a moment, she thought as a figurative ray of light broke through the dark clouds that had formed inside her mind. But there is one way. It was risky because she hadn't fully mastered that technique yet, but it wasn't completely hopeless. Hinata had realized a while ago that Yawaku wasn't a very powerful kunoichi, so even if the strength of the technique she had in mind wasn't yet as great as it could be, even the limited version she could use would most likely be enough. If nothing else, it should at the very least create the opening she needed. It would require a not insignificant amount of chakra, though. It was to the point where she would be able to use maybe one more palm rotation afterwards before being left with too little for another one. That, in turn, meant she would be capable of defending herself from her opponent's attack only one more time. And yet it was also her best shot at still emerging out of this victorious. She just needed a plan regarding how to continue once she had taken away Yawako's vision. She couldn't, pardon the pun, blindly rush forward as she had done before. Oh, no more clever remarks from you? Don't you want to plea for your life? Appeal to my conscience. Hinata didn't reply, still deep in thoughts. Yes, this might actually work. Really? Nothing at all? How disappointing. Yawako said, now sounding merely annoyed rather than angry or even exhausted. I hoped for a few more tears and cries, you know. You're my first Hyuga, so that would have been the least you could do. Especially after all the trouble you caused me. She paused for a moment. Then, whatever. Let's just get this over with. It was at that exact moment, assumingly when Yawako readied herself for one final technique, that Hinata struck, ignoring the pain in her left hand where the senbons had hit her as she waved hand seals. Kokwangayo no Jutsu. Bringer of Darkness technique. This was a high-level genjutsu, an A-rank technique. However, Hinata was not yet skilled enough to utilize the full potential of this technique. Because of that, it was effectively closer to a C rank when she used it. Her sensei had taught it to her for a reason, though, and which one became quite clear soon enough from Yawako's reaction. What the desh, she exclaimed before getting a grip on herself and trying, and failing, to break free from the illusion. Hinata didn't waste any time and began rushing towards her once more, ignoring how weak her legs felt beneath her as she tried to close as much distance between them as possible before the inevitable happened. I might not be able to use it as well as sensei, but it's still a powerful genjutsu. She felt a warm glow of pride in her chest as she recalled his praise for her progress during the very training session in which he had first informed her team of his intention to take them on their first C-rank mission. You won't break out of this one, Yawako. You stupid girl, don't think this changes anything. Just die already. Isan ni Idoru. 1000 needles. Just like Hinata had predicted, the other woman used the same technique she always used when things were getting perilous for her. She had managed to cross a bit over 3/4 of the distance between them by then, though, so it wasn't much of a problem. Hakusho Kaiten. 8 trigrams, palm rotation. Hinata was acutely aware of her quickly dropping chakra levels as she spun around herself, but while she felt a tingle of anxiety, Hinata managed to keep her cool. She had anticipated this, so there was nothing to worry about. The onslaught was even shorter than the previous one, lasting for only about 10 seconds before subsiding. The moment the attack stopped, Hinata pushed off the ground to close the remaining distance in one big leap while trying her hardest to keep her Byakugan activated and ignore the black dots that were starting to appear at the edges of her vision. Damn you! Sanbamu dash! Hinata was upon her before she could use the technique with which she had earlier created a weapon made from sunlight, foregoing her usual style in favor of throwing a punch with her good right fist towards where she assumed Yawako's face must be. She would never have believed it if someone had told her just an hour ago that she would one day feel like this, but the resulting crushing sound and painful scream was the most satisfying thing she had experienced all day. And the best part? The direct hit was apparently enough to disrupt the technique that made her radiate bright light, meaning Hinata could now actually see her. The shocked expression on Yawako's face while blood ran from her obviously broken nose wasn't one that she would ever forget. Neither was the angry one she adapted a moment later. Yawako did not even insult or shout at her. Instead, she let out a furious scream before lunging in her general direction, all restraint forgotten in the heat of the moment. Hinata was more than ready for it. The first swing went wide without her having even to dodge, and the second and third ones were easily avoided by simple steps to the side. Then, when Yawako threw her fist at her for the fourth time, Hinata made use of the fact that she could now see her opponent and thrust her fingers upwards to jab them against her wrist. The other kunoichi let out a cry when the tenketsu there was forcefully closed while simultaneously lashing out with a reflexive kick that Hinata simply evaded by crouching low to the ground. Following that, she tried to sweep Yawaku's legs away only for Yawaku to take a hasty step backwards at the last possible moment. Not to be deterred by that, Hinata ignored the protest of her muscles as she propelled herself into the air from her crouched position to deliver a roundhouse kick that Yawaku barely managed to block. Even so, it was still enough to force her to take a few steps backwards and unbalance her. Hinata almost buckled when she hit the ground again, but she knew that she couldn't let such an opening go to waste, so she merely gritted her teeth at the effort it took and rushed forward once more. Yawaku, still not having found her footing again, could do nothing to avoid the 3 jabs to her right arm and shoulder, and the only reason she didn't get hit even more often was that Hinata didn't dare to use her injured hand for the gentle fist as well. Letting out another pained cry, Yawaku stumbled back, but Hinata didn't let her escape. A moment later, the other woman's right arm went limp as 2 more tenketsu were forcibly closed, leaving her with only 2 legs and 1 arm, the hand of which was useless as it was the one Hinata had previously paralysed when she hit the tenketsu on its wrist, to defend herself with. 3 more seconds later and the left arm went limp as well. "You can't do this!" Yawaku exclaimed, but while she clearly tried to sound angry and commanding, no one would have mistaken her voice for anything but panicked. Hinata didn't wait for her to finish before preparing one final attack, gathering all her remaining chakra into her right palm and even adding lightning nature to it for good measure. She thrusted her hand forwards while holding it almost like a claw. It hit her mark on point, closing 5 tenketsu, 1 with each of her fingers, surrounding her solar plexus at once. This time, Yawaku only let out a quiet grunt as the force behind the attack threw her backwards until her flight was forcefully stopped when her back hit the wall that surrounded the mansion and its accompanying grounds. She had lost her consciousness even before she hit the ground. For a few seconds, Hinata kept standing where she was, her arms still extended and her breathing unnaturally loud in her own ears. Then, when the realization that Yawaku was truly beaten, that she had won, finally set in, all strength seemed to leave her body all at once as she collapsed to the ground. "I won," she muttered, not quite believing it herself. "I really won." Sure, she had decided that using that genjutsu to first blind and then overwhelm her opponent would be the best possible approach she could make, and she had been confident that she was actually more skilled than her opponent and would have a clear advantage once Yawaku's vision was just as limited as her own, but there had been a small part of her that had still been hesitant. A part that had been unsure whether it was really the right thing to do. Hinata remembered all the times she had been unsure about her own abilities, all the countless hours she had spent training the gentle fist, sometimes alone and sometimes with her uncle, cousin, or even her father, to be at a level that was expected of the Hyuga heir, all the sleepless nights she spent studying to stay on top of the academy curriculum, all the grueling training sessions with Team 8 that were just as rewarding as they were exhausting. Somewhere in the deepest corners of her mind, she had always been unsure whether she truly deserved to be where she was, as heir to one of Konoha's greatest clans and student to one of the village's most famous shinobi. Unsure whether she truly had the abilities to back a dream as big as hers. And now here she was, having just used the abilities she had spent all these years improving to overcome her very first life or death battle. The load that fell off her mind was impossible to describe with something crude as mere words. Even as the adrenaline wore off and she began to feel both the exhaustion from the fight and the pain of the wounds she had received in it for real, a smile fought its way onto Hinata's face. Then, a second later, she rolled around to lie on her back and look into the sky before she suddenly began to giggle. She just couldn't help it. At first, it was just a single gurgle that made its way out of her mouth. Hinata tried to suppress the impulse at first, immediately clasping her uninjured hand over her mouth, but it quickly became a battle she had no chance of winning. So, with no other choice, she let it all out. It was probably a good thing that no one was nearby to witness her very unsightly behavior right now. Her lying on the ground while covered in blood from all the countless small cuts on her body and giggling like a madwoman couldn't possibly make for a good picture. "I can't wait to tell Hanabi about this," she thought, her giggling intensifying even more when she remembered that she had thought there wouldn't be much to tell back when her sister made her promise to tell her everything once she returned. I'm sure she'll love hearing about this. She won. So it seems, yes. There was a moment of silence. Then, do you think we should check on her? See if any of her injuries are serious. The second person, a woman wearing a raven mask, tore her gaze away from her still giggling form of the Hyuga girl to look at her partner. "You have seen the fight, haven't you? None of the cuts that Teo has inflicted on her are in any way serious. I'm more worried about her head, actually." The woman rolled her eyes, and although she couldn't see her partner's face behind his own fox mask, she was sure he was currently spotting a smug grin. "He loves to make stupid jokes, doesn't he? Don't be like that, Fox. Can't you remember how it felt coming down from that adrenaline high after your first real fight?" Yes, I know. It was just a joke. And a very bad one at that." Everyone reacted differently to this experience, depending on both the circumstances and result of the fight as well as the person's individual character. Some, like the Hyuga, began to laugh like mad, others began to cry, some became silent and stared holes into the air for hours, and yet again others tried to act as if nothing had happened in the first place. There were countless different reactions, and compared to some Raven had seen before, giggling in relief was a relatively tame one. She took a moment to wonder how the girl would eventually react to her first kill before dismissing that thought. That wasn't her responsibility, so there was no reason to think about it. "Whatever," Fox said with a shrug, clearly unbothered by her comment. "I didn't expect you to understand humor in the first place. If that's what you call humor, I doubt there's anyone who would understand it. Anyway, wasn't all of this a little bit too much? I mean, it isn't as if the girl was in any real danger at any point of the fight considering we were here the entire time, but she didn't know that. Seems a bit cruel to make her think her life might actually be in danger, don't ya think?" The change of topic couldn't have been done less subtle, but Raven decided to go along with it anyway. "A bit, maybe, but who are we to judge how to train a genin? I was never a Jonin instructor, and neither were you." Fox snorted. "Please, I wasn't even part of a genin team, much less its instructor. However, that doesn't mean I can't have an opinion about this. I guess," she said with a shrug before tilting her head in thought. "I still don't see a problem with this, though. I mean, it's just as you said, regardless of whether she knew it or not, she was in no real danger at any point, so it should be fine, right?" Itachi Uchiha had sent one of his crows to the nearest Umbu outpost. Raven didn't even bother trying to find out why he even knew where they were, with a short message about some underhand ploy going on at the Kabasawa mines and a request for aid. After a short consideration, their squad leader had decided to send her and Fox to support the Uchiha in taking care of it. Neither of them had expected that all he asked them to do upon their arrival was to remain out of sight, observe, and only act if absolutely necessary. At first, they disagreed, arguing that they had more important things to do with their time, but after he explained the full plan to them, they understood his reasoning and ultimately agreed. Thus, they had played secret babysitters for the Hyuga girl ever since. He could have spared her a lot of emotional distress if he had just told her about us, though. But then she wouldn't have gotten this experience. To me, having one's first fight in a controllable environment seems like a pretty good thing, to be honest." Fox shrugged. "Maybe. Still seems like a weird thing to do to a genin if you ask me." Then, he snorted. "Well, I guess we can just blame it on him having been a child prodigy. They always do weird stuff that somehow ends up being a good thing. Just look at Haytake." "Sure, whatever you say." To be honest, Raven really didn't want to discuss this any further, so she simply didn't bother to disagree with her partner lest he started another discussion. "The sooner we finish here, the sooner we can return to our post. Shall we go and take care of the rest, then?" Thankfully, Fox agreed without making a fuss. "Sure." With that, the two disappeared in a whirl of leaves without anyone being any the wiser that they had ever been there to begin with. Chapter 63, Kabasawa Mines 9. Let's start this from the beginning. Kabasawa Mines 9. Itachi hadn't been idle while his students played bodyguards. However, where their jobs had been relatively easy, consisting of following a little girl around and observing a camp respectively, his part required him to cover a much larger area. That only made sense, of course, as he didn't simply watch a single person or even a group but rather their client's mansion as well as the nearby town, the bordering forest around it, and the nearby mining facilities. Needless to say, there was way too much running and not nearly enough sleep involved. Itaka could handle it, though. At the end of the day, this was nothing compared to many of the Umbu missions he had been part of, and while it had been years since he was part of that organization, the rest of his life outside of it had hardly been any easier. His crows took a lot off his shoulders, too. With them spying on the area from above, he had a system in place that could quickly alert him to his target's locations even if he himself was far away. Once he had found their hideout, it had been easy to have them keep an eye on them, making this a lot less stressful than it would have been otherwise. The only reason Itaka bothered to keep such a close eye on the area at all when he already had such an effective system in place was one particular member of the group he was targeting. Two of the missing nins were easy enough to assess and even recognize. For the woman, all it took was a quick look through his bingo book, allowing him to quickly identify her as a former kunoichi of Tsunagakure's Teo clan. A Chunin who left her village not long after achieving that rank with no notable abilities to speak of and, in fact, an evaluation that put her as below average in every field, including her own clan techniques. The second was a little bit more of a mystery, but according to what his summons had overheard, he was a former shinobi from Iwagakure named Guzan. A Chunin, too. He wasn't in the bingo book, which meant he was either thought to be dead, had only recently deserted his village, or that Iwa didn't want his betrayal to be known. Considering his low rank, however, that last possibility was rather unlikely. Furthermore, Itaka had sent one of his more intelligent summons, one who could actually speak, to check the man out, and it reported that his chakra reserves and general demeanor were nothing worth mentioning. Consequently, Itaka judged him to be no threat but took some precautionary measures anyway to guarantee nothing would happen to his students just in case he was wrong. Were it only these two, Itaka wouldn't have anything to worry about. He would, in fact, have been very satisfied with the situation because they were well suited to serve as his team's first opponents, strong enough to be a challenge but not to the point where they were an actual threat. Itaka had every confidence that his students would be able to take them in a fight, and even if they weren't for some reason, it would be easy enough for him to intervene in order to protect them against such weak enemies. Unfortunately, there was one more enemy to consider. One that he couldn't just brush off like that. The name of the leader of the group of missing nins was Hiken, a former jonin from Tsunagakure with a bounty of a bit over 700.000 ryo. For comparison, the amount of money Konoha had been given to have a team take care of the giant boars was 220.000 ryo, which by itself was already more than twice as much as a regular C-rank mission was worth. 700.000 ryo was an amount of money that was usually paid for important A-rank missions, making it clear just how much Hiken's former village wanted him dead. Itaka was confident that he would be able to take the man on in a fight, but that wasn't the problem at hand. No, what bothered him was the man's cautious nature described in the bingo book. And it was this very cautious nature that likely explained how Hiken continued to escape the watchful eyes of Itaka's crows. It wasn't even that the man was aware that he was being watched and consequently tried to escape their sight. Itaka was sure he would have long since fled the scene if that was the case. Rather, he was constantly on the move and changing his cover. While Guzan and Yawaka mostly stayed at their hideout in the woods Itaka had discovered a few days ago, Hiken had been there only once in all the time Itaka had observed the group. The rest of the time, he stayed in the town, constantly using different appearances to adopt another identity and switching to different ghost houses at least once a day. It was this trait that made his crows lose sight of him all the time. After all, there was no way to know if Hiken used the transformation technique while inside a building, meaning they wouldn't even notice him when he left it some time later. The only thing they could do was to keep an eye on every single guest house in the town, followed by then watching every single person that booked a room that day. At the end of the first day of observation, Itaka recognized that leaving Hiken to his crows wasn't an option and thus took over himself. He could detect the chakra Hiken used for a transformation technique, and even if he didn't, his Sharinon could see through every disguise the man might create. Regular disguises were a bit more tricky, but as long as he kept a close eye on him, even that wasn't enough to slip away from him. As he had to be subtle and remain unnoticed himself, Itaka still occasionally lost his target for short periods of time, but that had thankfully yet to become a problem. He usually found him again in a matter of minutes. However, even this short amount of time could become dangerous. If Itaka lost him and Hiken decided to move against Akihito and, as a result, his team, it would certainly prove lethal. It was because of this that Itachi was glad for his foresight to involve the Umbu in this. With them keeping an eye on things from the background as well, things were much safer. Not to the point where Itachi would let Heiken walk around unsupervised, mind you, but safer nonetheless. Anyway, it was because of this that Itachi was present when Heiken, in an uncharacteristic change of his routine, left the town 1 week after the boar attack, heading straight for the nearby mines. Coincidentally, it was at the same time that his crows notified him that the other 2 missing nins had left their hideout as well. It has begun, then. So, after telling his crows to notify the hiding Umbu team as well, Itachi had a decision to make his move. While he had no definite proof, he had a pretty good idea of what Heiken was aiming to do, and Itachi couldn't allow him to succeed. However, the question was whether he should go to stop him himself or leave that to a clone. It took him less than a second to come to a decision, and with that, he quickly formed the hand seals necessary for a crow clone before rushing after Heiken while his clone ran back towards the mansion. As much as he would prefer to go back himself, this was the right course of action. Heiken was the greatest threat anyway, so with him away, the situation at the mansion should be easy enough to handle. Right now, it was much more important to thwart the plot in front of him. It wouldn't be wrong to call it a matter of national security, even. Thus, Itachi followed after Heiken while making sure to stay just outside his target's awareness, wanting to make sure that his suspicions were indeed correct before confronting him. Also, even though he was confident that he was stronger than his opponent, there was no reason not to approach the situation a bit more cautiously considering his current state. Not only had Itachi used a much larger amount of chakra than necessary to create a clone that followed Shino and Kiba in order to protect them as good as possible, but he also just created another one just now which also needed a notable amount of chakra to proceed with the next step of the plan he and Akihito had agreed upon when Itachi agreed for his team to take care of this problem. So, while he wasn't exactly running out of it anytime soon, his reserves were lower than he would have preferred before fighting another Jonin, them being weaker than him notwithstanding. That meant caution was the name of the game right now. It was only when they were getting closer and closer to the end of the forest with nothing but the mines ahead of them that Itachi decided this was proof enough of his target's ultimate objective and moved to act. A single hand sign signaled the murder of crows that was still flying above them to act, and a moment later, they struck. They didn't fly straight towards Heiken but instead briefly accelerated their speed to overtake Itachi and Heiken both before plunging down in a curve to approach their target from ahead. To his credit, Heiken didn't panic, and neither did he hesitate for even just a second. The moment he noticed the crows, he stopped in his tracks and jumped down from the tree branch he had just landed on, clearly wanting to get closer to the element most of his jutsu were likely based upon. The fact that he was already flying through hand seals while still in midair reinforced this suspicion even further. Unfortunately for him, his actions played exactly into Itachi's hands. During the short period where he was in free fall, his movements were as restricted as they could be without him being outright tied up, and due to the commotion Itachi's crows were causing, Heiken was not only distracted but also unable to hear the sound of the weapons Itachi had thrown at him from behind flying towards his back. He was still a Jonin, however. One didn't rise to this rank without developing a sixth sense for such things. Consequently, Heiken managed to simultaneously shoot mud out of his mouth to stop the crows from reaching him while also throwing a look over his shoulder in time to adjust his body in a manner that allowed him to either avoid the kunao and shuriken coming his way outright or use the sword that was strapped on his back as a shield to block them. What he didn't notice until it was too late were the wires attached to the projectiles. Katon, Ryukan no Jutsu. Fire Release, Dragon Fire Technique. Before Heiken had the chance to do anything about it, he was immobilized, and barely a second later, just when his feet touched the ground, the flames of Itachi's technique, guided by his wires, hit him, exploding in a blaze of fire. Itachi's eyes remained on the spot where the fire was still burning, his Sharingan searching for even the slightest of details. Then he suddenly drew another kunao with an attached explosion tag and threw it at a seemingly random spot on the ground about 24 meters away from him. The paper bomb went off the second the weapon touched the ground. This time, Itachi didn't have to search for his opponent as he jumped out of the dust cloud a moment later, none the worse to wear aside from some meaningless scratches here and there. Impressive, he praised the man as he landed in front of him, sword drawn and his face twisted in a scowl. Using the flames of my own technique as cover to disappear underground using one-handed hand seals and trying to escape while I am distracted was a clever strategy. However, I'm afraid I can't allow you to leave just yet. Hyken wasn't a particularly intimidating person. He was tall and lean with a forgettable face and short brown hair and wore regular shinobi attire, including a gray flak jacket. All in all, there was nothing outstanding to him, his most notable feature being his sword. Consequently, when his scowl deepened, it did little to faze Itachi. Can I take from your presence here that your team never left the area in the first place? Itachi merely tilted his head in agreement while thinking about how to best approach this fight from this point forward. He would prefer to end this with a genjutsu as that was the easiest way to capture the missing nin, but against a jonin, anything short of one cast through direct eye contact would be foolish. With Hyken being smart enough to avoid that, however, and considering Itachi's currently relatively low chakra reserves, Taijutsu was the only realistic option he had available to him. Not necessarily a problem, of course, but an annoyance for sure. I knew you would become a problem the moment you arrived, Hyken scoffed. Kuzan and Yawaku are already taken care of, I assume. He was clearly fishing for information, but Itachi saw no reason to conceal this detail. They are. That's just wonderful. Not that it is much of a surprise, mind you. Their abilities were always rather subpar. And yet you were working with them. There's a tool for every task just like there is a task for every tool. They just so happened to fit for this one. Itachi hesitated for a moment, carefully thinking about what his next words should be. Then, in that case, does your presence here mean you were the right tool to enforce Tsunagakure's interests in this area? It was only a hunch, a theory without any evidence or proof based on otherwise unrelated and unimportant things, but judging from the slight widening of Hyken's eyes, Itachi had hit the nail right on the head. That wasn't what mattered right now, though. He or maybe the Umbu could interrogate the man at length later. For now, he had to focus on actually capturing him first, and the moment of surprise at his comment gave him the perfect opportunity to launch an attack. Itachi closed the distance between them in an instant, and the fight would have ended then and there were it not for the pair of hands that shot out of the ground and tried to grab him by his ankles. He managed to avoid them, but that short delay was all it took for Hyken to get a grip on himself and attack as well, swinging his sword in a small and efficient arc towards his neck. Itachi took a single step back to dodge the slash, then a second and a third when spikes burst out of the ground beneath his feet, and ultimately a big leap to avoid being sucked underneath when the earth all around him transformed into a swamp while simultaneously throwing several kunai with attached explosion tags to both cut off Hyken's escape attempt and force what he assumed to be the man's clone out of the ground. Not waiting for the resulting dust cloud to dissipate, he rushed forward again the very moment his feet touched the ground. A second later, he found himself ducking beneath a sword slash while throwing his fist towards Hyken's ribs only to have his arm redirected by a kick from his opponent's clone and a second sword aimed at his neck. Pulling his head in, he felt a breeze as the vertical cut missed him by a hair. Not letting that deter him, Itachi then continued by shifting his weight forward and moving into a handstand to throw a kick against the first figure's arm to redirect the sword that otherwise would have sliced him in half. He then pushed himself into the air, twisting his body to let the sword that had nearly decapitated him earlier pass harmlessly by as the second figure yanked its weapon up after him whilst using his momentum to land a kick to the head of its bearer. The head immediately exploded into chunks of rock, and the rest of the body followed shortly afterwards. Thanks to his Sharingan, there had never been any doubt about which one of them was the clone and which wasn't. Rather than staying upright, Itachi let himself fall into a crouch to dodge the slash that greeted him when he came back down before immediately following that up by trying to sweep Hyken's legs away. The man stepped to the side to dodge, but that gave Itachi enough time to straighten up, putting them on equal footing once more. Drawing a kunai, he blocked another sword slash to his head and then another to his waist while continuing to push forward, trying to close the distance between them as much as possible to make Hyken's sword more of a hindrance than a boon. But his opponent obviously expected that. It was, after all, a well-known tactic against sword users, so he would obviously have a way to deal with it. However, that was exactly what Itachi wanted, and it was when Hyken tried to counter this tactic that he struck. Letting his sword fall to the ground, Hyken tried to surprise him by suddenly pushing forward instead of falling further back, consequently reducing the distance between them to almost nothing. Itachi allowed his opponent to slap the kunai out of his hand to lure him into a false sense of security while using his other hand to stop the knee that was about to plunge into his stomach, knowing that it would be suspicious if he allowed Heiken to succeed with both his objectives. Following that, in what must appear like a somewhat desperate counter, he threw a punch toward Heiken's face which Itachi allowed the man to stop by letting him grab his wrist. Theoretically, this was a terrible position to be in. With basically no room to move, disarmed, and caught in a tight grip that stopped him from moving around freely, there should be no easy way for Itachi to avoid being stabbed by the kunai Heiken had just summoned into his free hand. Even if he used his own free hand, the one with which he had blocked his opponent's knee just a moment ago, the best he could hope for was to redirect the weapon and thus limit the damage he would receive. Practically, on the other hand, things were a bit different. This was proven half a moment later when Heiken gasped in pain and involuntarily let go of Itachi's wrist whilst his own hand hung limp in the air. The reason for that was the chakra scalpel surrounding Itachi's now free hand that had cut through the nerves and muscles of Heiken's wrist. Heiken was too experienced to let the pain stun him, but with his movements no longer restricted, Itachi managed to avoid the kunai without any trouble. Not stopping there, Itachi then used their direct proximity to do the same he had done to Heiken's wrist to his upper arm, rendering the entire limb useless. Now it was his opponent's turn to desperately lash out while trying to fall back, but that attempt was easily foiled when Itachi grabbed his wrist. With them standing too close to use kicks, his one arm held in a tight grip to restrict his movements, and his other one useless hanging to his side, there was nothing Heiken could do when Itachi jerked his head up with his free hand to look him straight in the face. The moment their eyes met, Heiken found himself in an illusionary world and tormented with the sensation of having metallic spikes driven through his body. "Well then," Itachi said, keeping his expression and voice deliberately cold, "why don't we have a little talk?" Nisshin was quite content with how things had played out. Yes, the fact that it wasn't Tsuda who came to their aid but a team led by Itachi Uchiha had been unexpected, but ultimately, it had turned out for the best. He had even been able to use the unexpected situation to his advantage and advance his plan even further. Yes, in the end, things didn't just go according to plan but actually even better than that. It wasn't that he had any grudge against Hirat Akihito. He had served the noble as advisor and master of the treasury for many years just like he had served the man's father many years before that, and he had been treated fairly by him during all that time. As eccentric as Akihito might be, no one could claim he didn't take good care of the people that worked under him. That was also the reason Nisshin didn't plan to kill him. It would be much more practical to do so and then use his daughter and rule through her, but he respected the man and his family too much to do so. Instead, he would simply force his compliance by threatening his daughter. He had, after all, no way to know that he would never really hurt the young girl. This was still cruel in a way, of course, but Nisshin considered it the by far more generous approach. And just like that, the final phase of his plan that he had been carrying out for nearly a decade now had finally begun. There were 3 crucial steps that needed to be taken right now, and that was what he had hired the group of missing nins for. As much as he would have preferred to let his own men carry them out, that was far too risky. They might be loyal to him or at least willing to switch to his side for the right price, but at the end of the day, they might still falter when it came to certain tasks such as these. First, he had one of his mercenaries go get Akihito's daughter, Nizu. With her in his hands, the noble would have no other choice but to do whatever he told him to. Why none of his men could do this should be obvious. Kidnapping a little girl was not something just anyone could bring themselves to do, especially when the girl in question was not only the daughter of a man they had no ill will against but also someone they actually knew well and, in some cases, were even fond of. Second, he had another of the mercenaries go take care of Mikata. The captain of the guards needed to be taken out of the picture if Nisshin wanted to take over, after all, and while he respected the other man for his dedication to his duties, their relationship was nothing more than professional. He wouldn't lose any sleep over his death. That fool had made this part laughable easy for him, too. Due to Mikata's insistence about solving the mystery of the boar attack himself, he was currently far away from the mansion and any possible eyewitnesses. Nisshin could simply arrange for him and his most trusted men to be killed out there in the wilderness and no one would ever suspect him. And finally, the last one of the missing nins would go and cause some, well, accidents in the mines. The narrative he was trying to sell was that they were slowly but surely drying up and that Akihito had ordered ever more extensive mining operations, so such accidents would be expected and only reinforce his story even further. Furthermore, it would be easy to use the resulting deaths to weaken Akihito's popularity in the town, taking away the man's support there as well. Once these three things were taken care of, Nisshin would have all the pieces he needed to fulfill his plan, just as had been promised by his backers. It was with these joyous thoughts that he and 6 of his men walked into Akihito's office to put him under house arrest. Nisshin? What is going on? Why are you dash? Please do not be alarmed, Akihito Dano, he interrupted him, knowing full well that his words would do little to calm the man considering the soldiers that had followed him into the room were in the process of subduing the one guard that had been in the room with him before he could even draw his weapon. By my honor, I promise no harm will come to you as long as you cooperate. Akihito was backing away as far as he could until he stood with his back to the wall, only his big oak desk standing between him and the 7 intruders. Cooperate with you? Nisshin, what in the name of all that's good is going on here? He gave the man a swallow bow, honest grief in his eyes when he looked up again. I'm afraid this is what people generally call a coup d'état, Akihito Dano. My deepest apologies, but I am taking control now. You can't possibly dash. As you will see soon enough, I very much can do this, yes. It was at that moment that 2 more figures entered the room. Nizu! Akihito exclaimed as he tried to jump forward only to be stopped by 2 spear tips pointed at his chest. Sweetie, are you okay? Considering the girl had a piece of cloth over her mouth, she couldn't reply, and the missing nin's hand on her shoulder stopped her from running towards her father as well, but her tear-stained face said everything that needed to be said. Nisshin! Akihito yelled, his earlier fear forgotten now that his daughter was involved. How dare you treat my daughter like this? He couldn't say he blamed him for reacting like that. He himself was less than pleased by this development. Yawaku, he addressed the kunoichi reproachfully, was it truly necessary to gag her? She's a child. Don't tell me she was too much for you to handle normally. The way her face twisted in displeasure was more than enough to express what exactly she thought of his opinion, although there was something off about it that Nisshin couldn't put his finger on. It was almost as if the expression was, well, less elegant than what he was used from her. Say about her what you want, but she was indeed a very beautiful woman that managed to make even the ugliest of expressions look good. However, he had no time to think about this further before she replied. I could take care of her just fine, she said with a disdainful scoff. You said not to hurt her, though, so I thought it better to gag her. Her endless screaming really makes you want to punch her lights out, you know. He briefly considered arguing with her before deciding against it. It would be useless anyway, and this was indeed better than having to listen to the girl's screams. At least Yawaku had done as she was told and not actually injured her. You won't get away with this, Akihito said through clenched teeth. There are over 100 guards in the mansion alone. You can't possibly hope to overwhelm them all, even with the help of mercenaries. Well, right now, there are only about 40 guards present, he gently corrected his former superior. The rest rode out with Mikata, remember? Our admirable captain took his men to recover the corpses left behind by the boar attack, find eventual survivors, and possibly even kill the boars themselves, leaving less than half of his men behind. Although calling them his men is a bit of a stretch, of course, considering a bit more than half of them actually answer to me. To be more precise, 28 of the 40 men left behind were on his payroll. Mikata had taken the rest of the men Nisshin had bribed with him, meaning they would be lost soon enough when Guzan killed the captain and all the soldiers with him. You may have the advantage right now, but as soon as Mikata returns, he will dash. He will do nothing. I arranged for him and the men with him to be killed. They will never return. And even if they would, they might find that they don't have as much as an advantage as you might think, Akihito Dano. A small, smug smile crept onto his lips. You see, all these guests we currently house, the supposed relatives of the victims we buried last week, are actually mercenaries as well. No ninja, of course. That would have been way too expansive. But mercenaries all the same. He could see in Akihito's eyes the moment the realization set in, almost making him laugh out loud. The boar attack, Don't tell me that was your doing as well. Now, Nisshin wasn't an idiot. Telling Akihito all the details of his plan would be nothing less than stupid. However, boasting at least a little bit should be alright, shouldn't it? After all, he had spent many years working towards this very moment. He should be allowed to enjoy his success. But of course it was. Just like pretty much every bandit attack and any other incident that plagued our trade routes for the last few years, I arranged for this as well. There's no better way to make you look incompetent than arranging for mishaps during the delivery of our goods, is there? Doing that had actually been a bit like a walk on a tightrope. On one hand, he needed to cause enough problems to leave no doubt about Akihito's incompetence when he ultimately deposed him and took his place at the top, but on the other hand, he couldn't cause too many problems lest Konoha or maybe even the daimyo decided to replace him with someone more capable. Nisshin was quite proud of himself to have pulled that off so successfully. But why would you do all that? He softly shook his head. As much as I would love to explain my reasons to you, there's really no time for that. My men are taking control of the mansion as we speak, and I have many other matters to attend to. A transition of power requires a lot of work, after all. He bowed once more, intending to express his respect for the other man one last time. Now, if you would please follow my men back to your rooms, I would be most thankful. Just do as you're told and I promise that neither you nor your daughter will be harmed. It visibly frustrated Akihito to be unable to do anything about his situation, and Nisshin felt honest pity for the man. It must be hard to admit one's own loss. Unfortunately for the noble, however, he had no other choice but to do just that. I think this is quite enough proof, don't you agree, Akihito Dano? Nisshin had barely enough time to be surprised at the sound of another voice speaking up before everything around him began to spin. A moment later, not only the 6 men accompanying him but the female missing Nin and Nizu as well vanished in thin air while 2 new figures he recognized immediately appeared on both sides of Akihito. You despicable worm. I always knew you were a slimy piece of shit, but even I would never have expected for you to fall so low. Itaka watched as Makata, the captain of the guards, took a step forward as if to strike the other man before he got a grip and limited himself to that exclamation. Makata. Nisshin muttered disbelievingly. What are you doing here? It was then that he realized that he couldn't move. And what is going on with my body? Where are my men? And dash. You're still under the effect of my genjutsu, Itaka spoke up before Makata had the chance to. We hoped to find out more details about your plans, but as you clearly intended to leave it at that, switching to merely speaking with you like this while keeping you immobilized seemed to be a more sensible approach. Genjutsu. For the first time since Itaka's team had arrived at the mansion, Nisshin's face distorted into an ugly scowl, but even that couldn't hide the budding panic he was obviously feeling. I don't know what you're still doing here, but if you know what's good for you, you will let me go this instant. My men dash. Your men are being detained and taken to the cells as we speak, Makata interrupted with a dark chuckle. I suspect they're not putting up much resistance either. Nisshin looked even more panicked at that, and hopelessly confused too, but no one bothered to explain the situation to him. The truth was that at this very moment, every single resident of the mansion was caught in Itaka's genjutsu. It wasn't a very powerful one, nothing that even a regular chunin couldn't break out from, but for civilians, that was more than enough. The technique in question was similar to the Temple of Nirvana technique that he knew had been used in the previous timeline to put a stadium full of people to sleep during the invasion of Konoha. However, rather than using feathers falling from the sky as a medium, Itaka used his crows to amplify and carry the technique over great distances. Thanks to that, the captain's men, which Itaka had deliberately left alone, didn't encounter any resistance as they moved through the mansion and arrested Nisshin's underlings. As to why the captain and his men were here in the first place, well, Itaka had sent a clone to his camp in the forest to warn him. Thanks to the letter Akihito had provided him with, the man had actually believed him and immediately returned to the mansion with most of his men, leaving only a skeleton troop and a double to deceive any potential spy Nisshin might send out after him. It would, after all, have been annoying if the traitor realized that something was wrong before they could snap the trap shut around him. Sneaking the guards in question back into the property had been somewhat troublesome, but that too had ultimately been no big problem thanks to his genjutsu making them all but invisible to the people guarding the gate. I recommend not to expect your hired missing nins to be of much help to you either, Itachi spoke up just when Nisshin opened his mouth. My team is taking care of them as we speak, so they won't be in any position to come to your rescue even if they were inclined to do so to begin with. The desperation on his face was growing by the second, and no matter how hard he tried to hide it behind an angry scowl, he was fooling no one. Why, Nisshin? Akihito said, his voice grave. Why would you betray me like this? Have I not always been fair to you? Have I ever mistreated you? The immobilized man let out a shaky laugh. This has nothing to do with you at all. Not everything revolves around you, you know. This is merely business, no hard feelings involved. Business? What kind of business is this supposed to be? Nisshin didn't reply, and if he could, Itachi thought he would probably already have turned his head to look away by now. As that wasn't an option, he instead settled for simply closing his eyes while remaining mute. Akihito didn't take that well. When Itachi-san told me a week ago that he suspected you of being a traitor, I didn't want to believe it, he said, his voice tight and his hands clenched into fists. Even when he explained his reason to me and the truth became more and more apparent, I wanted to believe in you. I wanted to believe that there would be a good explanation for all of this. When he explained that it would take someone with great insight in our logistics to arrange for so many ambushes on our caravans and incidents on the streets, I wanted to believe that it were mere coincidences. When he told me of the suspicious circumstances on the scene of the Boer attack and the report his students gave him about the survivors camping nearby with all our goods while talking about some secret boss they were working for, I wanted to believe that it was someone else. When I found out that the people we buried were actually clones created by shinobi rather than real people, I hoped that they were the real culprits, and when Itachi-san showed me the letters you had hidden, I wished against reason that they were just trying to set you up, but dash. Wait, my letters? Where did you find them? Itachi felt pity for his client. Akihito was clearly hit hard by the betrayal of someone he had trusted all his life, but rather than feeling bad about it, Nisshin only bothered to react to his words when the letters were mentioned. I suggest the next time you try to keep it a secret that you own a second house in the town under a different name, you chose someone else than your aide to carry your documents back and forth to you. Itachi had carried out an inspection of the entire mansion as soon as he and Hinata had arrived, but back then, he hadn't found anything suspicious. Certainly nothing incriminating his letters speaking of betrayal. In the end, it had been thanks to Hinata that he found this trail. She had taken her failure during their arrival here to heart and consequently tried her hardest to stay vigil, resulting in her using her Byakugan regularly to check the area for anything suspicious, and it was during these checks that she found out about the suspicious behavior of Nisshin's aide. After all, sneaking in and out of Nisshin's room in the middle of the night, 3 nights in a row, was no normal behavior. After that, it wasn't hard for Itachi to follow after him and find Nisshin's secret house and the letters and documents within, and while there was nothing that outright proved his traitorous actions, Itachi was more than capable of reading between the lines. Nisshin, apparently seeing no other choice, visibly closed off. I have no idea what you're talking about. Evidently having enough, the captain stepped forward to threateningly loom over him. Oh, so you don't want to admit it? Fine. We have ways to make you talk. I will tell you nothing. We will see about that. Itachi very much doubted the man would truly be able to endure a serious interrogation. Not that it mattered anyway. The Yamanaka clan had much more efficient ways to find out the truth, and there was no way Nisshin could defend himself against them. Until then, however. A crow came flying through the open window, landing on his shoulder and presenting him with a small note in his beak. What is it, Itachi-san? Did something happen? It was Akihito who addressed him, clearly looking for an excuse to avoid looking at Nisshin. It seems my suspicion was correct. The leader of the group of missing nins tried to set up a number of explosions to cause the collapse of several mine shafts. He has been beaten and captured before he had the chance to go through with that, of course. Akihito's shoulders slacked. That's one good news, at least. And what about the other 2? I have a clone with my students who observe Mikado-san's men in the forest, so judging from the fact that it didn't dissolve yet, we can assume everything went well on that front. My other student is watching your daughter and has the support of 2 Umbu, so the fight over there should already be over as well. "That's good," he replied, the relief on his face plain for everyone to see. "Very good indeed." Itachi nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. After all, the note had said more than what he told Akihito, and it was the other pieces of information he had kept to himself that bothered him. Until now, he had assumed Nishin acted out of self-interest. That he wanted to remove Akihito and take his place by taking the role of guardian of his daughter. He had concluded that Nishin's plan was to paint Akihito as a well-meaning but incompetent fool who had mismanaged the mines and its trade with Konoha. By causing problems for the caravans, he made it look like Akihito couldn't protect his own goods, and by causing accidents in the mines and making it look like they were drying up, he made it look like Akihito's mismanagement had almost resulted in them being shut down entirely. By asking Itachi to deliver a message about it to the Hokage, he had also made himself look like the only reasonable person present. A logical successor once Akihito was dismissed, so to say. Until he got the crow's message, he had assumed Nishin's goal behind that was to carry out an inspection of the mines that showed that it wasn't running dry at all as soon as he was in power, claiming the reason for why it looked like that was, again, because of Akihito's incompetence. Following that, he would rebuild the mines and stop his own attacks on the caravans to make himself look competent, resulting in him reaping all the profit the position brought with it. All the money he had hidden on other accounts under a different name could easily be explained as the profit he had made by selling the goods that had supposedly been stolen on the black market, too. With this new information he just got, on the other hand. What exactly is Suna's role in all of this? "I think we have heard enough from him," Mikata said with a dismissing scoff as he turned away from Nishin. "Let's throw him in a cell." The eyes of the man in question became wide. "You can't do that. You fools, you have no idea who dash." Itachi interrupted him. "One of the very first things I taught my students was to always accurately judge their own abilities against their opponents before they engage in battle. To only engage when they know they stand a chance." He raised one arm. "You were clearly never taught this lesson. Your mistake was to continue with your plotting even after my team arrived. If you were wise, you would have put an immediate stop to all your plans the second I stepped foot onto this property." Then, before the other man could reply, Itachi made a single hand seal to put him to sleep. "Next, let's go and see how Shino, Hinata, and Kiba are doing." It was time to finally finish this mission. Chapter 64, Kabasawa Mines X. Let's start this from the beginning. Kabasawa Mines X. As it turned out, all of his students had come out of their fights victorious. More or less unharmed, too. Hinata's wounds had been superficial for the most part, with the senbons that had hit her having neither been deep enough to do serious harm nor actually hit any of her vital spots in the first place. Her exhaustion had mainly stemmed from depleting pretty much all her chakra. From what the Umbu members who had observed her fight had told him, she had performed well. Maybe even better than Itachi had expected. Overcoming her initial fear and hesitation, using what he had taught her while keeping a cool head, and finally overcoming her opponent with clever application of a genjutsu, one, he might add, he hadn't even been aware she had mastered to such a level yet, that not only took the missing nin's advantage away but actually turned it against her was no small feat indeed. It was of particular note that in the end, Hinata hadn't hesitated for even 1 second to use the gentle fist to put her opponent out of commission. Considering how troubled by its inherent lethality she had been in the past, that was a big step forward. Shino and Kiba's fight had been notably more difficult. Apparently, Itachi's clone had been inclined to step in several times only to always stop itself at the last second when it turned out that it wasn't quite necessary yet. This indecisiveness was understandable, however. After all, it wasn't every day that the member of a clan that was supposed to be extinct showed itself. The last member of the Kesho clan had supposedly been killed during the waning days of the last war, and it had been a great relief for everyone who had the questionable honor of encountering them on the battlefield before. They had made themselves many enemies, and their crystal release was feared all over the continent for its lethality. Itachi's best guess as to how Guzen happened to possess the clan's Kekii Genkai was that he was some bastard born outside the village that Iwagakure knew nothing about, although there were technically some other possibilities as well. he could have successfully faked his death to avoid persecution, for example, or Uegakuer could actually know about his existence but chose not to make it public knowledge in hopes of getting their hands on him before anyone else realized that he existed. Guzan might very well be the last person capable of passing on his clan's bloodline, meaning not only Uegakuer but every village would love to get their hands on him, or, at the very least, make sure no one else would. That being said, Shino and Kiba fought valiantly. Their notoriety aside, Guzan's abilities were nothing too impressive, with only his usage of the crystal armor technique being truly worth mentioning. That alone was enough to give Itaka's students a hard time, of course, but it wasn't enough to could simply overwhelm them. That, in turn, allowed them to come up with a strategy to ultimately come out on top even if it was a bit closer than Itaka would have preferred. Combining the Gachuga in conjunction with the Earth Spear technique Itaka had copied from Kakuzu in the previous timeline to harden his skin and increase his attack's impact power was something he had been teaching Kiba and Akamaru for a while now, but he hadn't expected them to use it while transforming into a gigantic two-headed wolf, which also was a technique he hadn't been aware they had mastered yet, Itaka might add. The effect had been impossible to miss, breaking through Guzan's armor and doing some serious damage. And then Shino followed in both his teammates' footsteps and also used a technique Itaka hadn't been aware of, using his Kikaichu in a manner he had never seen before to finish the missing nin off. Well, at least almost. Guzan would probably have been able to kill them before falling unconscious himself had Itaka not intervened, but that was beside the point. The important takeaway from this was the more than just a little impressive performance they had put on. Of his two male students, Shino had clearly been the worse injured. Where Kiba had come out of the fight with only bruised and general exhaustion and tenderness as a result of his transformation, Shino's throat and ribs had been subject to quite some damage. Nothing too serious and certainly nothing that some rest wouldn't heal, but for sure the worst wounds he had ever received. Fortunately, Itaka had become rather proficient in medical ninjutsu over the last few years, so neither Shino nor his other students had to deal with what would otherwise have been a week-long rest period. By the time they woke up on the second day after their fights, all that remained from their laments was some exhaustion and soreness. It was this that made it possible for them to depart on the morning of the third day after Nishin's ploy had been foiled. Akihito had urged them to reconsider and stay a bit longer, but as far as Itaka was concerned, they had stayed at the mansion for long enough already. It was time to go home. Furthermore, he wanted to talk with his team about all that had happened and thought it would be better to hold that conversation somewhere that was not the setting of the incidents. That had been many hours ago. Right now, the sun slowly but surely began to set, and Itaka thought it might be about time to find a place to rest. They could continue to run through the night, of course, but there was really no reason to. They had made good progress throughout the day, especially considering they hadn't hurried as much as when they first set out from Konoha nearly 3 weeks ago and Itaka had given his mission report to the Umbu team that had gone ahead to take Nishin and his 3 missing nin back to Konoha, so he could take it a bit easier for now. Thinking about the traitorous advisor also reminded him of the bits Hiken had let slip regarding Tsunagakuer's involvement in all of this. Itaka hadn't had the time to conduct an in-depth interrogation, so he hadn't much to go from with his suspicions, but the little bit he knew was more than enough to be concerning. For some reason, Suna was interested in interfering with the Kabasawa mines, and Hiken, who was a missing nin, was the one they hired to enforce their will. Now, it wasn't exactly unheard of for hidden villages to hire missing nins to do their dirty work for them. In times of war, they usually didn't even bother to try and hide it. While the Umbu usually took over most covered missions that no one was supposed to know about, villages sometimes wanted to make absolutely sure certain actions couldn't be traced back to them and thus hired mercenaries to do the job. After all, even if they got captured, it wasn't as if their testimonies were worth much. Not every village had the Yamanaka clan to verify them, after all. It was rare, though, and it certainly never involved hiring a missing nin from their own village. And yes, Itaka himself had technically been such a case when he infiltrated Akatsuki, but that was due to rather unique circumstances that really couldn't be generalized. It was this fact that brought up another possibility. Hiken might never have been a true missing nin to begin with. Having a person be publicly known as a traitor meant that the home village they came from couldn't be held responsible for their actions. That was obviously an attractive opportunity for many. After all, wouldn't it be useful to have an agent in the field that could cause problems for the village's enemies without fear of facing any repercussions for it? Without fear of retribution? Because of this, every village had at least a small number of shinobi they officially branded as missing nins, even though they were in fact still loyal members of their homes. That was a delicate game to play, though. At the end of the day, there were still consequences to having traitors in their ranks regardless of whether they were real or not. Being publicly known for having many missing nins was bad for business, for one thing. Potential customers seeking their village's services would be deterred and might seek out someone else, losing the village money and, ultimately, power. It would also make them look weak in the eyes of their rivals for losing so many of their own and might even motivate them to try to exploit this perceived weakness. Thus, a village couldn't have too many of such fake missing nins, which in turn meant the ones that played the role must be strong and talented enough to be capable of fulfilling as many different tasks as possible. Of course, that was a problem in and of itself, as losing someone capable like that also took a hit on their prestige. Also, the person in question must be willing to do it in the first place. If not, it would be all too easy for them to become real traitors after they left the village. There were obviously not all too many people interested in such a thing. Yes, it was possible to fake their capture or even death after a few years and then give them a new identity, but usually, they never saw their home again, and everyone was aware of that. All this was to say that every single such fake missing nin was a valuable resource to their village, used only when absolutely necessary and for nothing short of the most essential missions. It would be truly concerning if Heiken turned out to be such a case, as that would mean Tsunagakuer thought it essential to do something at Konoha's most important iron mines. Itaka was snapped out of his thoughts when he noticed Hinata had abruptly stopped in her tracks, body tense, and Byakugan activated. She spoke up a moment later without him having to ask what was going on. "Sensei, there are people fighting ahead of us." Immediately, the atmosphere around them grew heavy, but Itaki remained calm. Hinata's sight didn't reach that far, so if the people in question were outstandingly strong, he would have noticed them himself by now. It didn't mean they couldn't be a threat, but it at least meant that he would most likely be able to protect his team without much trouble no matter what was going to happen. "Can you recognize whether they're shinobi or anything that identifies their affiliations?" Some kind of emotion flashed in her eyes, but he had no time to think about what it might have been before she dropped the bombshell. "Most seem to be normal bandits, but the ones they're fighting are Konoha-nin." She hesitated for about half a second. "Then, it's Team 7, Sensei." Hinata wasn't quite sure what she was supposed to feel now that the mission was over. On one hand, she was glad that they were finally going home. They had been away from Konoha for almost 3 weeks now, and while they didn't have a set return date in mind when they first set out for their mission, none of them had expected this mission to last very long. After all, with Kiba and Akamaru on their team, finding some boars had sounded like a piece of cake, and eliminating them once they found them didn't sound like much of a problem either. In all honesty, and with the benefit of hindsight, Hinata was sure she and her teammates would have found this mission rather boring were it not also their first C-rank mission ever. With all that had happened, however, the 1 to maybe 2 weeks she had privately expected had turned out to be a gross underestimation. By the time they returned to Konoha, they would have gone for almost an entire month. She was glad she had told Hanabi that she had no idea how long this mission could take. Her sister was probably missing her regardless, but without a particular date to look forward to for Hinata to miss, she should at least not get too worried about her. On the other hand, a part of her was actually sad that it was over. Yes, it had been quite stressful, and yes, knowing that she had technically never been in danger because her sensei had someone on standby in case she lost kind of took something away from all of it, but at the end of the day, none of that really mattered. She hadn't known that she wasn't actually in danger. She had stood her ground even when she thought she might die, and ultimately, she had won. It wasn't an understatement to say this had been the most important victory of her life. In a way, it proved that Itaka-sensei had been right when he told her that the only thing holding her back was herself. That all she needed to do to become stronger was to believe in her own potential and stop holding back. It felt as if a weight had been taken from her shoulders. As scared as she had been during the fight, the elation she had felt after the victory had been entirely worth it. These were the kinds of thoughts Hinata had as she silently walked behind her teammates, vaguely aware that there was much less chatter than when they had first set off from Konoha in the direction of the Kabasawa mines, but not thinking about it too much. Shino and Kiba and clearly just as much going through their heads as she did, so it was only natural that neither of them was in any mood for conversation. It was hard enough to pay enough attention to their surroundings anyway. Focusing on anything further than that was all but impossible. Unfortunately, none of that mattered anymore when she spotted something that made her forget all about the previous mission. "Sensei, there are people fighting ahead of us. Can you recognize whether they're shinobi or anything that identifies their affiliations? Most seem to be bandits, but the ones they're fighting are Konohanin." She hesitated for just one moment. "It's Team 7, Sensei." They were vastly outnumbered, although Hinata didn't think they were very bothered by that, judging from how Kakashi-sensei wasn't even participating in the fight but sitting in a nearby tree out of sight to enjoy the show below. That being said, while Naruto, Sasuke, and Sakura seemed to do well enough, they were outnumbered by a large margin, and while she didn't think their enemies were shinobi, they did have more chakra than a civilian had any right to have. They seemed to be fine on their own, but as fellow Konohanin, only standing by and not helping them just seemed wrong. Sure, there was probably no danger with someone like Kakashi Hataka there to protect them should it become necessary, but that didn't make it right to just leave them to their own devices. Evidently, Itaka-sensei agreed with her on that. "Let's go." No further comment was needed for them to jump into action, and a quick glance at her teammates proved that they, too, had pushed any unnecessary thoughts aside to focus entirely on the here and now. After all, a fight wasn't the right place to be distracted. Now rushing forward at high speed, it was only a matter of seconds before they began to hear the sound of people fighting each other, and it took only a few more seconds after that for them to reach the scene. Kakashi was still sitting on a tree branch with one hand in his pocket while holding an orange book with the other, only visible to Hinata due to her Byakugan but otherwise completely out of sight. Furthermore, she could also see that he wasn't actually focusing on the pages in front of him but instead watching his students' fights, making her wonder why he even had it out in the first place. Then there were Naruto, Sasuke, and Sakura, fighting against their enemies not too far from each other and demonstrating admirable situational awareness by helping each other out whenever one of them struggled for one reason or another. Or, well, at least Sasuke and Sakura were doing that. Naruto, on the other hand, clearly moved further and further away from his teammates with each passing second, too absorbed by fighting with whoever was right in front of him to notice that he was slowly but surely getting separated from them. It wasn't a problem yet considering he was still winning, but all it took for it to backfire was a single mistake, so there was no way to know for sure how long that would last. However, while he might have gotten a little overzealous in his pursuit of his opponents, Naruto's situational awareness wasn't necessarily worse than his teammates, so he noticed them at the same moment Sasuke and Sakura did, and it nearly cost all three of them dearly. Having a friendly team appear out of nowhere was quite a surprise, after all. Enough so to distract them and briefly break their concentration, even. Hinata and her team acted quickly, though, ignoring the various exclamations thrown their way in favor of jumping into the fight. Kiba and Akamaru rushed towards Naruto, the former blocking a knife slash aimed at the other boy's back while the latter threw the assailant back with a powerful kick to the chest, catapulting him right into a second incoming opponent and consequently thwarting that attack in the bud. Hinata and Shino, on the other hand, ran towards Sasuke and Sakura. Reaching the two in time to block the, due to the distraction their team's sudden appearance had caused, lethal attacks aimed at them was impossible, but a pair of thrown shuriken were more than enough to slow the pair of bandits down and give their fellow Konohanin the chance to notice what was going on themselves. As a result, the bandits were already defeated by the time they reached the two of them, Sasuke having twisted his assailant's arm before throwing him over his shoulder and Sakura having knocked hers out with a quick double ear slap. "Hinata!" Sakura exclaimed from Hinata's right while simultaneously blocking another incoming attack. "And Shino too? What are you doing here?" Much more importantly, Sasuke added tersely from the left without stopping his own fight, "What were you thinking, jumping into the fray like this? That distracted us just as much as it did them." Thankfully, Shino answered before Hinata had to, although she really wished he would have proceeded a little bit more, well, diplomatic. "We merely happened to pass by on our way back home and decided you might need a helping hand." It's not our fault you let yourself get distracted this easily. You dash. Guys. Sakura interrupted the two boys before they could start fighting each other as well. Can you leave this for later and focus on beating the people attacking us, please? Much to her relief, neither of them tried to argue, accepting that course of action even though they looked similarly displeased with it. Hinata supposed it was a good sign that they had enough energy to spare to waste on such meaningless things, but she was still relieved they focused back on the fight at hand and that Sakura had beaten her to put a stop to their behavior. Shino, she could have calmed down easily enough, but Suzuki was an unknown element she found hard to judge, so having the other girl settle this was truly the best possible outcome. Afterwards, things proceeded relatively smoothly. Thanks to her Byakugan, Hinata was able to observe the entire battlefield with ease, which allowed her to watch Kiba's fight without losing focus on her own opponents. For once, he wasn't using his clan techniques and instead relied on more traditional taijutsu. He swatted away a punch, broke through his opponent's guard, and rammed his elbow into his gut before quickly falling back again, yanking the bandit along behind him with an iron grip on his arm and then using the momentum to throw him into an approaching group of three. Following that, Akamaru appeared, using Kiba's shoulders as a springboard to propel himself onto the face of another bandit. The impact of that was enough to throw that one to the ground, but Akamaru didn't stop there and continued to jump onto a second and then a third opponent before rushing back to his partner's side. Now, while the second one had fallen to the ground as well, the third one had somehow managed to regain his footing. Not that it did him much good, mind you. Gotcha. The man had no time to react before Naruto connected a flying kick to his face that sent him flying. Not stopping there, Naruto also threw a kick to the face of the second bandit Akamaru had felled a moment earlier and who was just about to sit up as he ran past him, knocking him out cold in an instant. Then, to finish things off, he jumped into the air with an excited yell before landing with his knees in the stomach of the third one. Hinata's own fight proceeded just as successful. Compared to Yawaka or even the various opponents she had faced during training sessions in the past, these bandits were dreadfully slow, meaning she had no trouble countering their attacks and incapacitated them before they could even react. A quick jab with her finger and the arm of the bandit in front of her went limp, consequently making it impossible for him to offer any resistance when she grabbed the limb to throw the man to her side where Shino made quick work of him. One low sweep resulted in two bandits falling to the ground, and her subsequent heel kicks did the rest. Breaking through another bandit's guard, she quickly finished him off with half a dozen feather-light palm strikes before using his body as cover to do the same with a second and a third. To her right, Shino was taking care of several opponents of his own, using his staff to keep most of them at a distance only to quickly flash forward and knock one of them out before the rest could react. One punch was easily redirected towards another bandit with a graceful motion of the staff, briefly forcing these two to stop their attacks and therefore allowing Shino to jerk the other end of his weapon straight in the face of a third attacker. A moment and one horizontal swing later, the other two joined their comrade on the ground, quickly followed by a fourth one when Shino twirled his weapon around himself without turning around to knock another assailant out that had tried to sneak up on him from behind. Unfortunately, it was then that things became a bit more complicated. "Hey, watch out where you're going, idiot." Having seen what had happened meant Hinata was not as confused by Naruto's sudden exclamation as the other genin probably were, but she thought calling Kiba an idiot was a bit too much. Yes, he had kind of gotten into Naruto's way and even almost hit him with an attack meant for one of the bandits, but it was at least partly his own fault for not anticipating where his ally would be. She understood that the Inuzuka fighting style was wilder than what most people were used to and thus a bit harder to predict, but it really wasn't that complicated. Besides, Naruto and Kiba had been friends for years, hadn't they? He really should have known better. Hinata didn't have time to think about that much further, however, as something else that required her immediate attention caught her eye, and half a second later, the clang of clashing metal could be heard when one of her shuriken collided with one of Sakura's that had come far too close to Shino for her liking. "Sorry," the other girl quickly yelled over her shoulder. "I didn't mean to." Now, Hinata understood that a fight like this could be chaotic, especially for someone who doesn't possess the Byakugan, but she also thought one should really pay close enough attention to make sure they didn't accidentally hit their comrades. Sakura sounded genuinely apologetic, though, and it was ultimately up to Shino to decide whether he was cross with her or not, so Hinata, generally not fond of starting fights in the first place, decided to let it slide. Damn it, Shino, where are you even aiming with that thing? Sasuke had a point. As much as Hinata would like to defend her teammate, this time, she had no choice but to acknowledge that the fault lied mostly with him. After all, Sasuke had been standing still and weaving hand seals while Shino pursued a retreating opponent and almost hit Sasuke in the process. The only reason he didn't was that the Uchiha had noticed him just in time and took a step back to avoid that. What she could fault Sasuke for, on the other hand, was not checking what was in front of him now that his position had changed before he used his technique. Katon, Gokakyu no Jutsu. Fire release, Great Fireball technique. All of the sudden, the thing Hinata had to worry most about wasn't the bandits in front of her but the wall of fire that was quickly heading towards her, and it was only due to the advantage her eyes gave her that she could dodge it with ample time to spare. She usually disliked excessive profanity, but for once, the insults she could hear Kiba scream at Sasuke felt gratifying. Her unscheduled evasive maneuver had landed her in the last major group of bandits left, and while they didn't pose any noteworthy threat, the abruptness of the situation meant that she currently didn't have the attention to spare to do it herself, so having Kiba do it for her was quite nice. Not that she would actually have screamed insults or anything like that, of course. Her father would disinherit her if he heard she had acted like that. However, she did feel peeved at Sasuke's carelessness, so it was probably for the best that she didn't get in a position where she could be tempted to act inappropriately in the first place. Although nothing major happened after that, it was minor incidents like the ones before that marked the closing minutes of the fight, people getting into each other's way, them almost hitting each other instead of the remaining few opponents, and thrown weapons threatening them nearly as much as they did the bandits. Nobody was hurt, but by the time all enemies were beaten, the mood of everyone involved was at rock bottom. Then, in a puff of white smoke, Kakashi-sensei suddenly appeared next to them. "Well," he said in a painfully upbeat tone, "that sure could have gone much better. However, it also could have gone much worse. None of you was hurt, right? Some of those attacks came awfully close." Judging by the expressions on Team 7's faces, the mood was made even worse by his arrival. Chapter 65, Mission Gone Wrong. Let's start this from the beginning. Mission gone wrong. 2 weeks earlier. Finally. It's about time we got a mission. I can't wait to see Kiba's face when he comes back and realizes that his team isn't the only one who had won yet. Although Sasuke didn't disagree with Naruto's words, he still made sure to suppress the satisfied smile that tried to worm its way onto his face. Knowing their sensei, the man would surely find a way to turn any mischievous remark, regardless of whether it was actually a verbal one or just a facial expression, into an excuse for another brutal training session, and best friends or not, Sasuke had no intention of accompanying Naruto into one of those out of some sense of camaraderie. Kakashi-sensei knew how best to torture Ahum, train them until none of them had any energy left to do anything but collapse in their beds at the end of the day. "This is not a race, Naruto," Sakura said from where she was walking a bit ahead of them without even bothering to take her nose out of the book she was reading, having evidently come to the same conclusion as Sasuke. "Whether they had their first C-rank mission a bit earlier than us or not doesn't mean a thing. That would sound a lot more convincing if you hadn't been just as upset as Naruto when we first heard about it," Sasuke thought but knew better than to say out loud. Right now, it would be more beneficial to agree with her to stop their sensei from putting him in the same category as Naruto. "She's right, you know. Nii-san always takes the approach that practice makes perfect, while Kakashi-sensei puts more emphasis on sufficient preparation before acting. These are two completely different approaches." That was a bald-faced lie, of course. If there was one person who liked to overly prepare for everything down to the most unimportant detail, it was Sasuke's brother. It sounded convincing, however, and some subtle flattery towards Kakashi-sensei, who was walking a bit behind their group with his own book held before him, would certainly go a long way in endearing himself to him. "Shut up, Sasuke. You were the one complaining the most about your brother taking Kiba and Shino on a mission while we only kept doing these stupid chores, weren't you? Don't act all stuck up now." Inwardly, Sasuke smiled triumphantly at Naruto's predictable exclamation. He had expected him to say something like that and had subsequently a response prepared already. "I was upset, yes, but I have realized by now that it was silly. Like Sakura said, at the end of the day, it really doesn't matter that they went on a mission a bit earlier than us. Objectivity, flattery, and maturity, those were the three things he had tried to demonstrate in order to avoid whatever training session Kakashi-sensei was almost guaranteed to hold for Naruto after his earlier remark. If this doesn't work, nothing will. Oh, come on. There's no way you are already over it. You always sulk for days when Itachi doesn't pay you enough attention. As much as Sasuke hated to admit it, that remark was almost enough to make him forget the show he was trying to pull off and correct this gross misunderstanding, and only the sudden sound of a book slamming shut kept him from throwing away all his hard work in one fell swoop. Naruto! Sakura exclaimed, her volume matching his. Do you need to shout everything you say? It's impossible to concentrate when your voice is bursting my eardrums. But you're shouting as well. I'm not. Not looking a gift horse in the mouth, Sasuke wisely kept out of this fight. If they wanted to behave like little children, that was fine with him, but he had absolutely no intention of lowering his sensei's opinion of him when he had just barely avoided doing something stupid that would have resulted in just that. Meanwhile, Kakashi raised his book a little bit higher to hide the knowing smile that even his mask couldn't fully conceal, already musing about what kind of punishment training would be appropriate for all three of his cute little students. However, now that Sasuke no longer had to participate in the conversation, his thoughts were free to wander while he used only the bare minimum of attention necessary to keep alert of his surroundings. While the previous conversation might not have appeared like anything special at first, it was, in fact, the first time in a while that Naruto acted as one might expect from him. It wasn't as if he had been an entirely different person or anything silly like that, of course, but it wasn't only Sasuke who had noticed his friend's change in attitude over the last few weeks. Ever since Jiraiya, and on that note, Sasuke still didn't know why one of the Sannin took such a personal interest in Naruto even after all the years he had been friends with him, took him away from training for some kind of conversation without so much as a word of protest from their sensei. He had been more silent and absorbed into his own thoughts than before. He pretended to be just fine when he asked him what was going on, but Sasuke wasn't blind. He could see clear as day that something was bothering him. Now, he wasn't one of these people who claimed friends should tell each other everything. As far as he was concerned, everyone had things they wanted to keep to themselves. He certainly did. That had nothing to do with lack of trust but was simply a matter of not wanting to. That being said, the longer Naruto's weird mood continued, the more tempted Sasuke became to forget all about that opinion of his and force some kind of confrontation to make Naruto tell him what was going on. Seeing him going back to normal like this was therefore a relief in more ways than one. Not only was it great that he apparently got over whatever had been bothering him, but Sasuke also couldn't help but feel glad he ultimately wouldn't be forced to initiate a conversation the both of them would definitely find extremely uncomfortable. Just because he avoided bringing the topic of his behavior up didn't mean others did as well, though. The last time they met their friends, shortly before Team 8 left the village for their mission, Kiba and Koji had been very insistent about trying to make him talk while Shino lurked in the background with a thoughtful look hidden behind his high collar, and even Shikamaru had stopped complaining about how annoying everything was in favor of studying Naruto like one would an interesting puzzle. At the end of the day, no one was any the wiser, however. Sakura, too, had become more and more confused about his behavior until she eventually reached a point where she barely even tried to hide her worry. It has to be said that the two of them weren't exactly close friends. It wasn't as if they actually disliked each other, of course, and it was impossible to go through all these tedious D-rank missions together without growing closer to each other in the process, but both their personalities regularly clashed over the silliest things. These fights were mostly friendly in nature, but from time to time, things escalated to the point where someone else had to interfere. In a way, that wasn't all that different from his own relationship with Naruto, really, although they had at least the advantage of having known each other for years and being therefore in a position where they both knew when to stop. Not that they always listened to their own common sense, mind you, but it was at least a possibility. Anyway, regardless of what their relationship might ultimately be, none of her misgivings stopped Sakura from insisting on doing a personal examination to see if anything was wrong with Naruto, and while she might have insisted that she did that primarily to test the medical skills of hers she was so proud of, Sasuke was damn sure that was only an excuse to hide her true intentions. Needless to say, the result of that examination was that Naruto was perfectly healthy, giving no hint as to what it was that was bothering him. To be honest, if someone had told him before his graduation that he and Naruto would end up on a team with Sakura and actually get along with her, he would probably have laughed in their face. While his academy days weren't nearly as terrible and plagued by fangirls as Shisui had tried to convince him they would when he was younger, Sakura and Ino had at times acted pretty similar to the girls Shisui had told him about. The idea of cooperating and productively working with her seemed like nothing more than a daydream back then. Surprisingly enough, however, it turned out that her love for medical ninjutsu trumped her crush on him. When given the opportunity to showcase her skills, he was immediately all but forgotten. In hindsight, it was probably only thanks to this fact that the three of them had managed to cooperate so well during Kakashi-sensei's bell test. Were it not for her extreme fondness of that particular field, they might very well have failed. In the privacy of his mind, Sasuke actually thought that her preference for medical ninjutsu bordered almost on obsession, not that he would ever say that out loud, of course. Sakura regularly brought homemade bento boxes to their training sessions for the four of them, and he had absolutely no interest in somehow making her angry enough to stop doing so. Now that his mother was regularly out on missions again and Itachi had moved out, he was more and more often forced to prepare his lunch himself, and Sasuke would be the first to admit that his cooking skills were rather, well, lacking. Noticing that his thoughts were spiraling increasingly into unnecessary directions, he cleared his mind with a shake of his head. Now really wasn't the time to get distracted by such things. Yes, Naruto seemed to be fine and their teamwork with Sakura was better than anything they could have ever hoped for during their academy days, but a mission wasn't the time and place to muse about such things. With newfound resolve, Sasuke began to fully concentrate on their surroundings. After all, with both his teammates being still occupied with each other, it was up to him to make sure they didn't run into an ambush. Unlikely considering they had been on the road for only an hour so far and were consequently far too close to Konoha to encounter anyone who might possibly try to ambush them, but one never knew what could happen. Consequently, at least one of them had to be alert, and for now, that would be him. Ultimately, their mission was fairly simple. All they had to do was deliver a scroll given to them by the Hokage to the noble in charge of a small town right on the border of the Land of Rivers before heading back home with a scroll given to them by the aforementioned noble to be delivered to the Hokage. Despite its size, the town was very important, serving as a trading hub for not only the lands of fire and rivers but the land of wind as well. Although Naruto knew that the message couldn't possibly be very important if a freshly graduated genin team was the one tasked with delivering it, he had been excited nonetheless when they were first told about the mission. After all, this was their first C-rank mission, they would be allowed to leave Konoha for the first time in their lives, and they would also get to visit another settlement. Needless to say, while this mission might not be something exciting like rescuing a princess from the clutches of some evil criminals or fighting a missing nin, Naruto had still very much looked forward to it. However, this is so boring. He hadn't expected how little there was to do while they traveled. On the first day, just being on the road had been a lot of fun. Naruto had still been in high spirits then. It took 6 days to reach the town, though, and by then, he had been absolutely done with the utter boredom of the situation. Nothing ever happened. Then, when they finally arrived at their destination, they didn't even stay there for long. They arrived in the evening, greeted their host, slept in his mansion for the night, and departed once more the very next morning. I wanted to check out the town, damn it. Now, at the end of the second day after his team had begun their journey back home, there was nothing left of his initial good mood. I still think we could have stayed in the town for at least a day or so. Considering neither Sakura nor Sasuke, both of which loved to argue with everything he said just as much as he loved to intentionally rile them up, told him to shut up, they clearly agreed with that sentiment. Kakashi-sensei, on the other hand, merely sighed. As I already told you several times, Naruto, this isn't a pleasure trip but a mission. As much as I would have liked to stay a bit longer there myself, this is one of the times where finishing the mission is more important than our comfort. Even if this delivery is not so urgent as to require the utmost haste, we cannot afford to dawdle unnecessarily. Unexpectedly, it was Sakura who spoke up next. Although considering she had been very vocal about looking forward to strolling through the market, it was probably not all that surprising after all. Well, Technically, if we had stayed there for, say, one more day, we would have had the chance to rest some more and consequently would have been able to travel much quicker now. One could even argue that we would have arrived at Konoha much earlier that way. Exactly. Naruto immediately voiced his support. You always say we need to think ahead, don't you, sensei? It would have made much more sense to take a short break before hitting the road again. Sasuke nodded, not bothering to say it out loud but not trying to keep his agreement a secret either. Unfortunately, their sensei didn't play along. Oh? Are you telling me that just traveling from Konoha to that town already took such a toll on you that you needed a day off? Behind his mask, Kakashi-sensei's face twisted into an apologetic look that even a child would have easily recognized as fake. If so, I sincerely apologize. I should have trained you better. I will organize a special training regime for you guys as soon as we're back at Konoha, and once you're done with that, I promise you will be able to run the entire way to the town and back in a day without even breaking a sweat. No, that's not what I dash. That's really not dash. But sensei dash. Ah, no need to thank me, the man interrupted them, intentionally misreading their reactions with what he probably thought was a humble expression. I'm your sensei, after all. I'm just doing my job. Just a few weeks ago, Naruto would have complained about the unfairness of it all, but by now, he knew better. Trying to change their sensei's mind would result in only even more training, and while Naruto had more stamina than both his teammates combined, Kakashi-sensei always made sure to come up with some particularly strenuous program for him that left him just as exhausted as Sakura and Sasuke. This is so annoying. So, just like he always did when he was annoyed with something, Naruto made sure that Sasuke was in just as much of a bad mood as he was, not that he technically had to do much to manage that at the moment, of course. Sasuke was just as affected by their sensei's attitude as he was. As was Sakura, too. Logic had never stopped him before when he wanted to vent a little, though, and he wouldn't let something silly like that get in his way now either. He folded his hands behind his head and adopted a deliberately thoughtful voice. Well, in that case, maybe we should hurry up a bit? It would be a great warm-up, and we wouldn't want to keep the old man waiting, right? He then looked directly at Sasuke to make sure the other boy realized his next comment was directed at him specifically. Besides, I didn't get to finish furnishing my new apartment before we set off, you know, and I really want to get back to that. Sasuke's failed attempt at suppressing his annoyed groan was music to Naruto's ears. Naruto, I swear, if you start talking about how awesome your new place is even just one more time, I'm going to dash. Oh, don't be such a killjoy, he interrupted his friend, knowing all too well how much he hated that. There's really no reason to be jealous. I told you, you're always welcome to come over whenever you want. I'm not jealous because you're, for once, right in that there's indeed no reason to be jealous. What's so great about living on your own anyway? You're only saying that because you're still set about Itachi moving out. Sasuke tried to shrug that comment off, but Naruto knew he had struck a nerve judging from the throbbing vein on his forehead. Why should I? I'm spending more time at his place than at home anyway, so it's not like I don't get to see him anymore. It's actually quite nice because I don't need to do any chores there, something which you will have to do all the time now that you live on your own, I might add. Naruto shrugged, noticing out of the corner of his eye that Sakura and Kakashi-sensei had slowly but surely gotten some distance between themselves and him and Sasuke, but ignoring it for the moment. That, too, was an increasingly regular turn of events whenever they got into an argument. It will be fine, he said dismissingly with a wave of his hand. The apartment isn't that big. How much work can it be? That was true. It was more than spacious enough for a single person. The 2 weeks he had spent there before the start of this mission had pretty much proved that, but at the end of the day, it really wasn't very large. And sure, it might have gotten a tiny little bit messy in that time, but that wasn't because he was some kind of slob who threw all his stuff into some corner before forgetting about them. The matrons at the orphanage would have never allowed such behavior. No, it was because he just moved in and didn't get to finish putting everything in its place yet. Really. Also, all these recent revelations about the Yondaime being his father, which was awesome, and him being the host of the Ninetales, which was much less awesome, were kind of distracting, so cleaning hadn't been his top priority. That would change as soon as he got home, though. Sasuke wouldn't even be able to recognize the apartment the next time he came to visit. You're saying that now, Sasuke replied with a smug smirk. Let's see if you still think like that in a month from now. Oh, we will. And if worst came to worst, he could just create a few shadow clones to help him out. I'm so glad Itachi taught me that technique. It's a real lifesaver. After all, it would be a real shame if the nice apartment got ruined because he couldn't clean up after himself. The best thing about his new home was probably its location, being right next to the main entrance to the Uchiha district. It literally took less than 5 minutes to get to Sasuke's house, even if you were just walking leisurely. Combine that with the fact that it was only a stone's throw away from Konoha's largest marketplace, and one could understand Naruto's initial surprise not only when the Sandaime showed him the place but particularly when he was told about its price. Even after the old man explained that the village would bear a certain percentage of the costs, the rent was still unbelievably cheap. Naruto had thought he would need some of the money he had apparently inherited to pay for it all, which would have sucked because it wasn't that much, but in the end, he could probably make ends meet with just the stupidly high number of D-rank missions his team was doing, even if only barely. Which in turn meant he could use that money for other things. Both the Sandaime and Jiraiya had told him to not spend it all at once and to put some away, and Naruto definitely planned to do just that, but there were so many awesome things he wanted to buy. Maybe he could even buy a sword and convince Kakashi-sensei to teach him how to use it? Or maybe some new clothes. I hate to interrupt you guys, Kakashi-sensei suddenly interrupted them without looking remotely apologetic, but I just remembered something important. Naruto and Sasuke turned around simultaneously, but it was the latter who spoke up first. Something important? Has it to do with the mission? Ah, yes, I guess you could say so. So do we need to get back to the town and dash? No, their sensei spoke up before any of them could get their hopes up. Nothing of that sort, I'm afraid. In fact, it doesn't even affect you guys all that much in the first place. Then, before either of them could reply, he opened one of the many pockets on his flak jacket and pulled out the scroll they needed to deliver to the Hokage and casually tossed it to Sakura, who fidgeted with it for a moment and almost dropped it to the ground before she could get a proper grip on it. Here, take that for a bit, would ya? But Sensei dash. I have some very important Jonin stuff to do. Very important, and even more dangerous, so I will go alone. You three just focus on finishing the mission. He gave them a one-eyed smile, hand raised in farewell. See ya later. A moment later, his form vanished in a puff of smoke. Naruto, Sasuke, and Sakura looked at each other, their expressions varying from shocked to surprised and even annoyed. Most of all, however, all three of them were exasperated. So, Sakura began after a few seconds of awkward silence, what do you think this was all about? Who knows? Sasuke replied while pinching the bridge of his nose. I don't think there's anyone who really knows what's going on inside his head. Even my brother said he's a total nutjob. Naruto blinked. Wait, Itachi said that. Well, maybe not in so many words, no. He at least had the decency to look a little sheepish at that admission. I can read between the lines, though, and that's definitely what he meant. Somehow, Naruto doubted that, but he honestly agreed too much with the sentiment to feel the motivation to argue with Sasuke about it. Whatever. I guess we should move on, then. Sakura nodded with a sigh while putting the scroll Kakashi-sensei had given her into her bag. We might as well. Not much else we can do anyway, and I really want to get home and take a bath already. Now that sounds like a plan. Besides, what's the worst that can happen? With these optimistic words, they continued their journey toward Konoha. Less than an hour later, they walked into an ambush that would soon prove to be only the first of many. Check the description for the links to the author.